The Force has never meant one thing. To the Jedi it is harmony, a binding energy that surrounds, penetrates, and connects all living things. To the Sith it is domination, a well of power that rewards strength and punishes weakness. But even among these ancient orders, there have always been outliers, those who don't merely use the Force, but those that reinterpret it. Those who see it not as an energy or a power or even a destiny, but as a philosophy. One of the most famous examples of this is Darth Traya, the exiled Jedi Master who came to see the Force itself as a malevolent god. She believed the Force was an uncaring manipulator, a will that used both Jedi and Sith alike as puppets in a cosmic game. To Traya, the Force was not to be served or obeyed, it was to be defied. But today, this is not the story of Darth Traya. This is about something far more disturbing. Another philosopher of the Force who didn't see the Force as a tyrant, but as something worse. A mirror. This is the story of Darth Ruin, a Jedi Master turned Sith cult leader who believed that only his mind could truly comprehend the Force. A man who thought that the galaxy, the Jedi, the Sith, and all other sentient life were simply wrong. A man who convinced 50 Jedi to abandon the Order with words alone, who walked among the ashes of the Sith Empire and resurrected that empire through belief, and who became so feared that his own followers turned on him, terrified he would consume them all in a ritual to ascend beyond mortality itself. This is not a story of war, a story of conquest, or a story of lightsaber duels. This is the story of what happens when someone is so certain in their own truth that they can make others believe it too. This is the story of Darth Ruin. Before he was Ruin, he was known as Phannius, a Jedi Master in the final century of the New Sith Wars, and even then he was dangerous. But he was dangerous not because of what he did, but because of how he thought. Phannius wasn't like other Jedi. He didn't challenge the code with emotion, or violate the rules of attachment. His heresy was more subtle, and far more insidious. Phannius believed that reality itself was subjective, and that truth, morality, even the Force were constructs to be bent around perception, and more specifically, his perception. Phannius began to argue that all sentient beings, Jedi, Sith, civilians, rulers, teachers, they were all incapable of understanding the Force, that their interpretations were childish, that their codes, their philosophies, their moralities were flawed lenses through which they distorted what the Force truly was. And only he, through his superior intellect, could see the Force clearly. This was not arrogance in the typical sense of the Sith, it was something worse. He embraced solipsism, the belief that the self is all that truly exists. Phannius didn't just believe he was more intelligent than the rest of the Jedi. He began to believe that only his consciousness was the real one, and that everyone else was just practicing in a collective illusion too primitive to understand. Because of this, the Jedi Council grew very uneasy. They attempted to contain his teachings, to debate him, to ignore him. Nothing worked. Because Phannius wasn't just some raving heretic. He was brilliant, charismatic, thoughtful, a master of argument and persuasion. He didn't shout down at his critics, he dismantled them slowly, publicly, and always with a smile. Eventually though, Phannius would depart the Jedi Order, not in exile, not in shame. He walked away because he believed the Order had nothing left to teach him, that no one did. And on that day that he left behind a message too, a message that would haunt Jedi historians for centuries. The Force shall free me. Not just us, not the Jedi, not the Sith, me. After his departure from the Jedi, Phannius disappeared from all official record, but he didn't go into hiding, not right away. He remained active in public discourse for some time, not as a Sith Lord, but as a rogue philosopher. He wrote, taught, and debated. He gave lectures in forgotten corners of the galaxy, and most dangerously, he listened. He listened to those that were disillusioned, angry, curious, and misunderstood. Over the course of months, perhaps even years, he began to draw many followers. Not fanatics, not warriors, but thinkers, idealists, students of the Force who, like him, felt suffocated by doctrine and tradition. And then something unprecedented happened. 50 Jedi left when he officially departed the Jedi Order and laid down his title. There were no battles, there was no bloodshed, it was only words. The Jedi that followed him not because they were promised power or wealth or revenge, but because he convinced them that they were already living a lie, that the Force is not what they had been taught that it was, that they could become part of something deeper, more true. This was not a seduction, it was ideological conversion. Phannius offered them meaning, a new understanding, a reason to believe that their doubts were not weakness, but rather that it was clarity. And once he had them, he vanished. The Jedi were left fractured, afraid. They had seen many embrace the dark side before, but none like this, never through pure ideology. Never through persuasion alone. Many historians would later compare his fall to that of Dooku, another charismatic Jedi who left the Order and influenced the galaxy with concepts bigger than violence. But even Dooku had relied on power, prestige, and even war. But Phannius didn't raise his saber at all. He raised a mirror, and he asked others if they liked what they saw. And it was after this that Phannius ceased to be, and Ruin was born. Darth Ruin. After orchestrating the defection of 50 Jedi, Darth Ruin disappeared into the stars, but his mission was far from over. But again, he was different. He didn't raise an army, he didn't declare war on the Republic. What he did was far more patient, far more terrifying. He went on a pilgrimage to the graves of the old Sith Empire. The galaxy, after nearly 1,000 years of Jedi dominance, had long since forgotten many of these places. Worlds like Ziost, Korriban, Thule, and Umbria, they had all become little more than ghost stories. The Sith were dead, their teachings were fractured, their followers reduced to cults, tribes, isolated warlords who clung to scraps of forgotten doctrine. And it was among these remnants that Darth Ruin preached. He didn't approach the lost Sith as a conqueror, he came as a prophet. He told them that the Sith had failed not because they were weak, but because they were wrong, because they had misunderstood the Force, because they had corrupted themselves with obsession, tradition, and rivalry, and that Darth Ruin alone could lead them back. Some attempted to kill him, others knelt. Slowly though, tribe by tribe, Ruin began to rebuild the Sith. But it wasn't the Sith of old, it wasn't the Brotherhood of Darkness, or the legacy of Naga Sadow. This was something new. He offered them not just strength, but meaning, a grand unifying theory of the dark side. He promised them that they were not just survivors, that they were chosen, that they would become a part of something eternal, something that transcended war and death and weakness. And whether out of fear, awe, or belief, many followed. This is what made Ruin so deadly. He didn't just gather Force wielders, he converted them. He built a cult on power alone, but something greater. He built a cult on faith. In the shadows of dead empires, Ruin raised a new one, not built on fear, but on worship. He didn't just revive the Sith, he made himself the reason that they existed. By the time Darth Ruin had gathered and then scattered the tribes under one banner, Darth Ruin had achieved what no other Dark Lord had accomplished since the days of the Ancients. He had resurrected the Sith. But the vision he offered wasn't one of galactic conquest, not at first though. It wasn't about vengeance on the Jedi. It wasn't about balance or revenge or even ruling. Ruin's new Sith were not united under a philosophy of strength through conflict as the Brotherhood of Darkness would one day be, or through cunning as Darth Bane would later restore. Darth Ruin's Sith were unique. Ruin's Sith were united by belief in one being. That being was Darth Ruin. And the longer that they followed him, the more they realized something was terribly wrong. To Ruin, the Sith were not allies, not students, not even tools. To Darth Ruin, the Sith were nothing, and he made no secret of this belief. To Ruin, they were fragments of a failed galaxy, lesser shadows orbiting his brilliance. They existed only to reflect his power, to affirm his vision. Where previous Sith sought to strengthen their apprentices, Ruin belittled his. Where most Sith demanded loyalty, Ruin demanded irrelevance. He didn't even call his apprentices at all. He called them squires. Ruin was not interested in building an empire that would last. He was interested in proving that he was the only being that was worthy of the Force, and that all others were expendable. Even his chosen squire, Erraticus, was never truly trusted. Ruin saw him and all others as placeholders, manifestations of a reality that only existed to serve his self-mythologized ascension. This wasn't just tyranny, it was theological madness. And the longer his cult served him, the more they began to suffer. He began to sacrifice followers without explanation, executed loyalists at random. He would test their faith not to purify them, but to affirm his own importance. And when the whispers began, when the other Sith began to fear what would consume them all would be some sort of ritual that only Ruin knew about, some self-deification, Ruin did not address them. Because to him, there was no threat. To believe anyone else could betray him meant believing that someone else even mattered. And this is what made Darth Ruin really terrifying. Ruin wasn't pretending to be a god. He believed he already was one. In the end, Ruin's reign was as brief as it was apocalyptic. He had accomplished the impossible, the resurrection of the Sith. He had forged them into a single coherent ideology for the first time in centuries. he had sparked a galactic conflict that would become known as the New Sith Wars, a war that would stretch across 1,000 years and see the Republic collapse into fear and chaos. And yet Ruin himself would not live to see the first of any great battle. He was too certain, too invulnerable in his own mind. He held his disciples in such low regard, he viewed them as literal nothings, that he never even considered the possibility that they would strike out against him. His single-minded philosophy of self-interest, his absolute monomania, he was consumed by the one thing that even the Sith cannot discard: caution. And so quietly they conspired, not for power from their master, not for vengeance, but for something far more pure: survival. His followers had tracked him across dead worlds, believed in his message, surrendered their autonomy to his will, but now they feared for their existence. Some of the Sith believed Ruin intended to drain their life essence in a ritual to transcend the mortal plane. Others believed that he had already begun. Whether these were delusions or well-founded truths, though, it didn't matter. The cult that he had created, the galaxy he had rebuilt in his own image, turned on him. And Darth Ruin, the philosopher god who believed he alone could wield the Force, was murdered. Not by the Jedi, not by the Republic commandos, but by his own followers. And he never saw it coming. Because how could nothing kill a god? Ruin's legacy did not end with his death. If anything, it only began here. The Sith had reawakened, and they would continue to wage a war on the Republic for 1,000 years. His cult would fracture into new sects and new warlords, each echoing pieces of his vision, but none holding it completely. Because how could they? The Republic would be dragged into century after century of conflict. Jedi armies would rise and fall, and darkness would settle over the galaxy like a plague. Ruin's madness became a virus, and the galaxy became the virus's host. Though he never raised a fleet or conquered any world, Ruin's beliefs, his certainty in his own supremacy, this ignited a conflict that would take a millennium to extinguish. And by the time that war finally ended at the Battle of Ruusan, the Sith were thought destroyed for good. Only one, though, would remain in secret: a Sith who understood exactly what had gone wrong. Darth Ruin left the Jedi Order to pursue his own philosophy of self-interest, and gave rise to a 1,000-year war that concluded at Ruusan. And who was among the last to hold the Darth title, until I have claimed it again. To Darth Bane, Ruin was both a warning and a lesson. A Sith who shattered the Jedi not by war, but with words, and united the Sith not with fear, but with faith. But also a Sith who fell not to his enemies, but to his own delusion. Where Ruin believed in self above all, Bane believed in the system, the rule of two. He forged it to correct the chaos that Ruin had spawned. A system where every Sith would be tested through combat, survival, not through worship. But perhaps the most haunting thing about Darth Ruin is that he almost succeeded. Had he not fallen into madness, had he not dismissed his own followers as insects, he may have reshaped the galaxy forever. He may have become the living nexus of the Force that he had imagined, a god in all but name. Because in the end, Ruin didn't fall because he was wrong. He fell because he believed only he could be right. So remember this: the Sith do not always rise with fire. Sometimes they rise with thought. And the Force does not always serve balance. Sometimes it becomes a mirror, one that reflects back only ego and those that dare to claim it. Darth Ruin didn't need to kill to corrupt. He just needed to convince you that no one else mattered. And in a galaxy ruled by belief, that is all that it takes. There are places in the galaxy where history lingers, worlds where the past is not merely remembered but imprinted, burned into the very soil, whispered by every shadow, carried on every storm. One such place is a city, not Coruscant, the shining heart of the Republic, not Korriban, the ancient tomb world of the Sith, but a metropolis raised in secret, shrouded in eternal storms, and forgotten for centuries: Kos City. Once it was the greatest Sith capital ever built, a dark reflection of Coruscant itself, a functioning metropolis of millions where Sith Lords ruled openly, where citizens lived and worked beneath the watchful eye of the Emperor and his Dark Council. And from its spires, fleets were launched, armies were raised, and wars were planned and won that would shake the very balance of the galaxy and the Force. And yet today, Kos City is nothing more than ruins. It stands as a symbol of both the power and the fragility of the ancient Sith. A city that rose from desperation, thrived in secrecy, and fell into silence, not conquered by any Jedi, not burned by the Republic, but undone by the very forces that created it. To understand Kos City is to understand the nature of the Sith, their endurance, their brilliance, their cruelty, and their inevitable self-destruction. In this exploration, we will trace the city's entire arc. First, the odyssey that brought the shattered Sith survivors to a forgotten colonial world, and the dark rituals that transformed it into a fortress of storm. Then, the rise of the city itself, a sprawling metropolis that reveals the Sith society and what it would look like at its height. And finally, its fall to ruin, a haunting reminder that even without Jedi intervention, the Sith will always turn their greatest creations to dust. The Odyssey and the Exile. The story of Kos City begins not in triumph, but in ashes. The Great Hyperspace War ended not in a stalemate, not in an uneasy truce, but in annihilation. The Republic, victorious after a desperate struggle, vowed that the Sith would never threaten them again. The Jedi too saw no reason to show mercy now. What followed was not a retreat or an exile, what followed was a purge. The combined forces of the Republic and the Jedi descended on the Sith homeworlds. Korriban, Ziost, every colony that they could reach. Entire cities were razed. Populations numbered in the millions were slaughtered. Monuments and temples that had stood for centuries left in ruin. It was one of the greatest genocides in the history of the galaxy. And for the first time, the Sith were not predators, they were prey. It is often described in broad strokes that the Sith fled or went into hiding. But the truth is far more brutal. They were hunted, their ships pursued into deep space, their strongholds rooted out and destroyed one at a time. Sith who lingered too long on a world were exterminated, their bloodlines severed, their knowledge lost. For the first time, the Sith were not merely weakened, they were truly beaten. Yet even in defeat, the Sith would not yield. From the ashes rose one figure who would reshape their destiny, Tenebrae, the Dark Lord who would later become known as Emperor Vitiate. More than any other Sith, Vitiate understood that survival required patience. Where others would have scattered, hiding in small enclaves or seeking revenge in futile strikes, Vitiate had a vision of consolidation. He gathered the survivors, drew to those who would follow, and commanded them to abandon what remained of their broken empire. This was not the proud Sith march of old, it was a flight into the unknown. For 20 years, the shattered remnants of the Sith undertook a desperate odyssey across the galaxy's uncharted frontiers. The journey was a brutal one. Treacherous hyperspace lanes shredded ships as they navigated paths no one had charted in millennia. Beasts of impossible scale lurked in the void, preying on stragglers. On world after world, the Sith attempted to establish footholds, only to be discovered and hunted again by Republic forces still scouring the galaxy for any survivors. Every step of the way, their numbers dwindled. The Sith, once feared for their unrelenting power, found themselves constantly on the edge of extinction. They had always believed in their destiny to dominate, but for those 2 decades, their only destiny was now survival. And then they found it. A world long forgotten, a fragment of their ancient empire lost to memory. Dromund Kaas, the forgotten world. In the ancient empire, Dromund Kaas had been nothing more than a colonial holding of the old Sith Empire. It was not sacred like Korriban, nor central like Ziost. It was a frontier outpost, a source of resources, and pretty much little else. When the Republic crushed the Empire, Dromund Kaas was abandoned, and its hyperspace routes obscured. In the centuries that followed, it slipped deeper into obscurity, erased from galactic memory. To the Sith exiles, its obscurity was its greatest strength, remote, hidden deep within the treacherous space. Dromund Kaas became the perfect sanctuary. Here, Emperor Vitiate declared that the Sith would rebuild. The survivors descended into the jungles of the world and established a small settlement there. At first, it was little more than a refugee camp, a desperate effort to endure. But Vitiate was not content with mere survival. He was shaping not only a refuge, but the foundation of a reborn empire. But next came the corruption. Dromund Kaas became more than just a hiding space. It became a world forged in the image of the Emperor's will. Its storms cloaked it from detection, its dangers shielded it from intrusion, and its growing aura of dark power served as both fortress and symbol. And at the center of the storm, the settlement grew. The Sith survivors dug deeper into the jungles, cutting through vines and stone to lay the first foundations of what would become Kos City. At first, it was small clusters of shelters, then districts, then sectors. As the decades raged on, the settlement swelled with new arrivals, Sith drawn from across the remnants of their people, slaves brought to work the land, merchants willing to risk the storms for profit. Slow, inexorably, the small jungle outpost began to grow into a metropolis. But from its very birth, the city was different from any Sith city that had ever come before. Korriban had been a necropolis, a graveyard of tombs. Ziost had been a capital of old power, ceremonial, and arcane. Droman Kos, though, was something new. Born in exile, cloaked in storms, and fueled by the Emperor's corruption, it was a city forged in secrecy and survival. There was no mere refuge here. This was the seed of vengeance. And as the city began to rise, so too did the power of the Sith who had fled into the shadow. From the brink of extinction, they were about to transform into the greatest threat the galaxy had ever seen. It stood as the living heart of the reconstituted Sith Empire, the base from which fleets launched, wars were planned, and vengeance against the Republic was made into a reality. But what made the city remarkable was not only its function as a military stronghold, it was a metropolis. A vast, high-functioning society under Sith rule where millions of beings lived, worked, and endured beneath the shadow of the dark side. The structure of the city. At its core, Kos City was divided into 6 great hubs, districts that reflected the Empire's complexities. Each hub was more than a simple administrative zone. They were layers of a functioning city where day-to-day lives of Sith citizens unfolded under the control of their masters. Hub 1, the closest to the Imperial Citadel, where ministries of state functioned. Here, bureaucrats, officers, and Sith aides managed the logistics of the Empire. This was the face of the Sith Order. Hub 2 dominated by barracks and command centers. Soldiers marched in formation, officers shouted orders, and war machines moved through its squares. Hub 3, the Ministry of Travel and its sprawling complexes. Here, civilians and merchants navigated the bureaucracy of moving in and out of the storm-wrapped world. It was here where the Empire's isolation was carefully controlled. Hub 4 and 5, spaceports, markets, and industrial sectors. Merchants sold supplies, smugglers thrived under Sith patronage, and laborers, many of them enslaved, maintained the infrastructure of the city. Hub 6, residential quarters, where Imperial citizens, families, and even low-ranking Sith apprentices lived in tightly controlled districts. Each hub reflected a piece of Sith society. Together they formed something greater, a city that was both a capital and a living machine of Imperial order. But what of the Citadel? At the city's heart loomed the Imperial Citadel, a monolithic structure of black stone and metal. To those who gazed upon it, it was a symbol of Sith dominance, unshakable, immovable, towering above the sprawling city. Within the Citadel, power was concentrated into 2 centers: the Emperor himself, veiled in secrecy, a godlike figure whose presence few ever encountered. Then there was the Dark Council, 12 Sith Lords each presiding over a sphere of influence: military, strategy, intelligence, logistics, and so on. For the average citizen, the Citadel was untouchable. Few entered, and fewer ever exited. But its shadow dominated every street of the city, both physically and symbolically. It reminded all who lived there that the Sith did not merely command armies, they commanded life itself. But what was daily life like there? It is easy to imagine a Sith capital as a place of constant bloodshed and duels in the streets, and while fear was ever present, Kos City was a functioning society. This is partially why I wanted to explore it in this video. It had rhythm, a pulse, and a way of life that sustained millions of Sith. For civilians, Imperial citizens lived under strict order. Families raised children in residential sectors, workers filled the bureaucratic ministries, and merchants kept the markets alive. They lived with a degree of stability, so long as they all obeyed. Then you had the slaves and the laborers, the foundation of the city's infrastructure. They maintained the streets, harvested the food, and served in households. Their lives were harsh, but their suffering was hidden beneath the order of the city. Then you had the merchants and the smugglers. Despite its storms, Kos City was a hub of commerce. Weapons dealers, spice runners, and black market trades thrived here, their profits taxed and regulated by Sith officials. The city's spaceports were alive with constant activity. But then we have the military. Soldiers drilled daily in the barracks of Hub 2. The city resounded with the march of boots, the hub of speeders, and the presence of war machines. Kos City was not only a metropolis, it was a garrison. Then you had the actual Sith. Lords, apprentices, and acolytes walked the city's streets. Their presence commanded fear. They trained in academies, schemed in hidden chambers, and vied for influence within the Dark Council. For an ordinary citizen, life in the city was a balance of opportunity and terror. Advancement was possible through loyalty and service. failure could mean enslavement or death. It was an atmosphere of fear and order. The city was unlike Coruscant in one crucial way though. Where Coruscant thrived on diversity and light, Kos City thrived on fear and control. Every district was patrolled, every ministry was tightly regulated, the Emperor's secret police rooted out dissenters. The very storms above seemed to echo the will of the Sith Empire, a reminder that even nature itself bent to their command. And yet, within this oppression, there was stability. Crime was punished harshly, order was maintained. Merchants found profit, civilians built lives. The city functioned not in spite of Sith dominance, but because of it. Kos City proved that the Sith were capable of more than destruction. They could build, they could govern, they could sustain a society, not one simply built on liberty or compassion, but one built on hierarchy, discipline, and fear. It was from this city that the Sith rebuilt their galactic power. The Great Galactic War was launched from its spires, fleets poured from its spaceports, armies marched from its barracks. Entire campaigns were directed from the Imperial Citadel. At its height, Kos City presided over half of the galaxy. Entire civilizations lived and died by the decrees that issued from its ministries. The Emperor's voice, spoken through the Dark Council, reached every corner of the Empire. Kos City was not simply a simple city itself, it was the dark heart of civilization. A mirror of Coruscant. It was a city that rose from desperation, thrived in secrecy, and presided over an empire that once ruled the galaxy. But as with every Sith creation, its greatness carried with it seeds of its own undoing. The story of its fall is not one of fire or conquest. The Republic did not storm its walls. The Jedi did not burn its citadels. Kos City crumbled in silence, undone not by enemies, but by the Sith themselves. The key to its downfall began with the Emperor's withdrawal. The man who had given Kos City its form and its storms, who had shaped the very world through ritual, began to vanish. Emperor Vitiate, whose patience and wisdom had rebuilt the Sith, withdrew from its throne. His ambitions had turned inward, towards ritual of immortality and godhood. For centuries he obsessed over consuming entire worlds, bending life itself to his will. Kos City, once the seat of power, was reduced to a staging ground for his greater designs. Without the Emperor's presence, the Dark Council grew in influence. But where he had been a unifying figure, the Council was a nest of rivals. Ambition clashed with ambition. Spheres of influence warred in secret. And though the city still functioned, the cracks beneath its surface widened. It was a slow fracturing. The Great Galactic War and the conflicts that followed drained the Sith. Campaigns burned resources faster than they could be replenished. Worlds seceded. Rebellions flared. The city remained its capital, but its lifeblood weakened. The 6 hubs that had once thrummed with activity began to strain under the weight of instability. Ministries fractured with corruption. The military, once disciplined, was spread thin. Civilians endured stricter controls as resources dwindled. And yet, the most destructive force was not the Republic, it continued to be the Sith themselves. The Dark Council's endless scheming, assassination, and betrayal left the Empire paralyzed. For every victory won in war, another was lost to Sith ambition. Kos City was the center of this rot, a metropolis whose order depended on leaders who no longer cared to preserve it. And so the world reclaimed its own. Beyond politics, the very environment of Drome and Kos turned against the city. The Emperor's rituals had poisoned the skies, twisting the world into a storm-racked wasteland. For as long as the Empire was strong, Kos City endured. Its infrastructure held the storms at bay. Its people bent the jungle to their will. But when the Empire's strength fractured, so too did its control over the world. The storms grew harsher, unchecked by Sith sorcery. The jungles pressed inward. Wildlife, twisted by centuries of corruption, prowled closer to the city's edge. Stone cracked. Monuments wore down. The jungle began to reclaim what had been carved from it. And then, the silence. No single moment marks the fall of the city. No siege, no climactic destruction. Instead, its decline stretched over centuries. One by one, all of it went dark. The barracks emptied. Families departed or were killed. And the Citadel itself stood once as the embodiment of dominance, stood hollow. Its chambers abandoned. Its halls echoed with silence. But the city didn't fall immediately. It withered. By the time of Luke Skywalker's era, nearly 4 millennia later, it remained standing only as ruins. Abandoned, silent, swallowed by the storm. the greatest Sith metropolis had become a ghost, forgotten by the galaxy that it had once ruled. The ruins of the city carried with them a truth more haunting than its destruction. The Republic had not needed to defeat it. The Jedi had not needed to invade. The city proved that every age of Sith history reveals that the Sith do not need enemies to bring about their downfall. They will do it themselves. They carry with them their own ruin. Its rise had been forged by desperation, its strength maintained by order and fear, and its fall inevitable, because the Sith could not escape themselves. The Dark Council devoured itself in endless rivalry, and the city that once stood as a mirror to Coruscant was left empty not by war, but by neglect. I wanted to make this video because Kos City really shows something important. While the Sith rule is possible for a time, they will always eventually tear themselves apart. It's a pattern we see time and time again throughout Star Wars, from Sidious to Maul, to empires to individuals. What makes the city fascinating is that when we think of the Sith, we usually imagine them in small numbers, plotting in the shadows or dominating on a battlefield. We don't picture them as a functioning civilization, a society that mirrors something closer to Coruscant, or even our own massive cities in our world. Kos City forces us to confront that possibility, and its ruins remind us why it could never last. There are many names buried in the long history of the Sith Order, lords who conquered empires, shattered worlds, and defied death itself. But among those countless shadows, there is one whose name lingers differently, not as a conqueror, not as a savior, but as the whisper that made the Sith afraid of their own reflection. They called her Darth Phobos. Little survives in the archives that is certain. Fragments from corrupted holocrons, half-burned temple scrolls, scattered references from both Jedi and Sith chronicles. Each agrees only on this. Darth Phobos was the terror that turned the predator into the prey. The Sith, who worship power and fear nothing but weakness, turned against her. And centuries later, when her influence spread like a poison through the galaxy, Jedi and Sith were forced into an uneasy alliance, an event so rare, so unthinkable, that every historian treats it as legend rather than record. How powerful must a single Sith have been to make the dark side itself recoil? What kind of being could bend the masters of fear through fear itself? To understand why her existence fractured the order that raised her, one must go back to where the sand first stirred on Korriban, to the stories of a child born among tombs, to a woman whose beauty was as disarming as her mind, and to a darkness that learned not merely to wield fear, but to feed upon it. This is the tale of Darth Phobos, the hidden fear. The story begins on a world that was never meant to breathe again, Korriban, the tomb world of the Sith, where the bones of empires slept beneath red storms. For millennia, the Jedi forbade life there. It was a wound in the galaxy left to scar over and to fade. And yet in the stillness of that dead world, life did return. No one agrees on how. Some say that deep within the Valley of the Dark Lords, a dying Thelian priestess performed a final act of devotion, a ritual to awaken Korriban's slumbering heart. They say the ritual consumed her, drawing the planet's remaining power into her womb. When she died, the tomb itself exhaled, and from that breath, a child was born. Others whisper of a secret cult that survived among the crypts, remnants of the original Sith species who refused to abandon their ancestral world. They claim the child was prophecy, a sign that the dark side had not yet died there. They raised her in silence beneath the sand, teaching her to listen to the force that echoed through the bones of the planet. And when she came of age, only she emerged from the tombs. There are skeptics, of course. They claim that Darth Phobos fabricated her origin, using myth to shroud herself in inevitability, in legend, that she was no child of prophecy at all, only a cunning manipulator who understood that fear begins with mystery. Whatever the truth is, even her enemies agreed on one thing: her existence was an impossibility, a living being born of a world long thought dead, a heartbeat carved from the stone. To some, she was Korriban's final gift, to others, its final curse. The first records of Darth Phobos described her as serene, articulate, mesmerizing, a woman of striking beauty. Her presence seemed to calm the air around her, until it did not. It is said that her voice carried warmth at first, a softness that invited trust, but behind every word lay a tremor, a dissonance that brushed the edge of instinct. Those who spoke with her for too long claimed their hearts would race without knowing why. Phobos learned early that fear hides beneath admiration, that the easiest way to break a mind is to make it love you first. And when that trust cracked, when the moment of dread arrived, she felt it. To Phobos, fear was sweet. She said she could taste it, that she could feel it rising through a victim's veins like ice. She could sense the heartbeat slowing, the chill of surrender. She began to crave that sensation the way that others craved air. Fear nourished her. It sharpened her mind and filled her with life. In time, she no longer sought control over fear. She surrendered to it. And in doing so, the dark side answered her call. When she entered Sith society, she was dismissed as a curiosity, elegant, brilliant, but too refined for the brutality of the dark side. That illusion, though, did not last long. Phobos studied emotion as others studied war. Where most Sith mastered anger, she studied the moment before anger, the pulse of fear that precedes every violent action. She discovered that fear was the foundation beneath every emotion that the Sith revered and worshipped. Rage, jealousy, ambition, all of them born from fear. And once she learned to feel it, she learned to command it next. Her rise was swift and silent. She killed few, yet her rivals vanished all the same. Some went mad, others killed each other in paranoid delusion. Whispers spread through the academies that Phobos could walk into a room and sense what every being feared the most, and that once she knew what they feared, they then belonged to her. At first, many Sith began to emulate her, then they began to avoid her. In weeks, entire circles of power collapsed into isolation as her influence spread. The dark side itself rippled around her. It wasn't violent, it was invasive, a slow sickness of the mind. As she grew in power and as the years went on, the Order began to fracture. Fear had turned inward. The Sith were devouring themselves, and at the center of it all sat Darth Phobos, untouched, watching and feeding. It was the Council of Lords that decided she could no longer be allowed to live, but even together they did not dare to face her in person. They conspired from a distance, weaving a plan built on deception. They promised Phobos access to an ancient relic buried deep beneath Korriban's sand, the remains of a weapon that could amplify her psychic gift. It was bait. When she arrived in orbit aboard her flagship, dozens of warships lay in wait. As her vessel descended toward the planet, the fleet opened fire. The bombardment was swift and merciless. Turbo lasers tore through the flagship's hull, igniting its core. Witnesses on the surface saw a bloom of crimson fire in the sky, scattering debris across the Valley of the Dark Lords. It is said that for 3 days the sands burned, and when the fires died, nothing remained but twisted metal and black glass. The Sith celebrated. They had purged the infection. In their arrogance, they believed fear could be killed from a safe distance. But among the debris, one escape pod was missing, its trajectory lost in the storms above Korriban. The record ends there. For a time, the galaxy believed that Darth Phobos was dead, but fear's not so easily buried. It waits, it listens, it evolves, and it remembers. The Cult of the Undying. For decades, her name faded into rumor. The Sith carried on, fractured but functioning, convinced the infection had been burned out of their blood. But across the Outer Rim, small disappearances began. A mercenary ship found adrift, its crew gone. An outpost on Droman Kos wiped clean overnight. No signs of struggle, no trace of killers. Only the same sigil carved into the walls and holes alike. A Thelan rune meaning fear. The symbol spread, whispers returned, and in time those whispers became sermons. From the void came a new faith, a network of fanatics calling themselves the Devoured. They spoke not of the dark side, nor of the Force, but of a voice that guided them in their dreams. They claimed that Darth Phobos had transcended mortality, that when the Sith struck her down, she had not died but become something greater. They preached that through perfect understanding of fear, she had discovered the only true path to immortality, to live within the minds of all who felt it. Among her followers, she was not a lord or a teacher, she had become a demonic entity, a god. The cult grew in secret. They abandoned their names, carved her symbols into their skin, and whispered her doctrine, that fear was not weakness, that fear was life itself. To feel fear was to remember existence, to sense one's own mortality and thus taste eternity. And through that fear, Phobos watched them all. Those who served her claimed she could see through their eyes. They heard her voice not in meditation, but between breaths, soft, seductive, coaxing. She never shouted, she never commanded, she simply suggested. When they killed, they felt her pleasure echo in their own nerves. When they hesitated, her disappointment froze them like ice. and when they were afraid, she fed. Phobos had once said that fear was sweet. Her followers swore that they could feel her drinking it from them, that the air itself would grow heavy and electric whenever they faltered. Some claimed she could taste terror across the stars, that she could smell it the way blood calls to beasts. To her, every heartbeat of panic was nourishment, every scream a hymn. Her followers became walking altars, each one a vessel for the fear of others. As they spread across the galaxy, the shadows thickened yet again. Then came the event that broke the silence forever. Across 1,000 systems on the same night, her cult struck in unison. Sith academies, Jedi enclaves, merchant vessels. No one was spared. Entire stations went dark in minutes. Witnesses described enemies who smiled as they died, smiled as they butchered. Acolytes who whispered Phobos' name while impaling themselves on their enemies' blades. When the killing stopped, the same mark appeared everywhere. The rune of fear etched in blood. The massacre would become known as the Night of the Rune. It was too precise, too coordinated to be coincidence. The Jedi suspected Sith involvement. The Sith blamed the Jedi. But when the evidence was compiled, the impossible emerged. Both orders had been attacked simultaneously. Both had heard the same whispers in meditation. Both had seen the same face in their dreams. Darth Phobos had returned. Panic spread faster than any army could. Jedi Masters abandoned their meditations and their students alike, fearing what they may see behind their own eyes. Sith Lords fled their citadels, convinced that to sleep was to invite her into their minds. The most powerful beings in the galaxy were reduced to paranoia and to silence, and Phobos fled. Each act of fear rippled through the Force, strengthening her presence. The Jedi describe her as a cold resonance, a static that infected every mind capable of feeling. The Sith called it the Pulse. To them, it was the dark side itself shifting beneath their feet, its balance warped by something older, something primal. The Sith tried once more to hunt her down. They burned worlds suspected of harboring her cult, but every fire only spread her legend further. The Jedi attempted exorcisms, isolation, even complete detachment from emotion, but that only made the fear stronger when it inevitably returned. The Orders began to realize a truth that neither could accept. Darth Phobos had not only survived their attempt on her life, she had transcended death. She had become what they feared the most, the embodiment of fear itself. When the killing reached Coruscant, when every Jedi temple's walls echoed with the phantom laughter, the Council made a decision that never was before recorded. They sent envoys not to the Senate, but to the Sith. The Sith met them in a secret neutral ground, and for the first time in history, light and dark sat at the same table with the same purpose: survival. Their agreement was brief. The hunt for Darth Phobos would not be waged by nations or orders, but by individuals. The Jedi would provide knowledge. The Sith would provide weapons. Each would choose their strongest to join a single force, an alliance of opposites unified by terror. Exactly how many answered the call is debated. Some chronicles claim hundreds joined the crusade. Others insist that there were only 10. 10 of the greatest force wielders of that era, half Jedi, half Sith, chosen to confront the woman who had turned fear into a god. Their destination was unknown to all but their mission's leader, whose name has been lost in the centuries that would follow. The records end with a single line preserved in both orders' archives though. The trail leads back to the tombs, to Korriban, or what remains of it. From that moment, the story passes beyond history and into legend. What follows cannot be confirmed, only remembered. They say fear unites nothing. They were wrong, because in the end it was fear that brought the Jedi and the Sith together. Fear of a woman neither order could control. Fear of what she had become. They did not call it an alliance. They called it the hunt. They followed her shadow through the Outer Rim, through derelict temples, and worlds where entire populations had vanished overnight. Each ruin bore the same mark carved into the stone, the rune of fear. At last their trail ended on a dead moon near Korriban, a place the Force itself seemed to recoil from, and there, beneath red clouds, stood a black temple, ancient, silent, and waiting. The descent. They made their approach in silence. No wind, no sound, only the echo of their own breath inside the helmets of their suits, their armor. The surface was a graveyard. Around the temple, hundreds of bodies knelt in perfect rings, hands clasped, heads bowed. They were not decayed, only drained. The skin clung to the bone like paper. Their mouths hung open, as though caught in the middle of a prayer. Some say their eyes still looked upward, frozen on something the living could never see. The hunters moved between them without speaking. Every step echoed too loud, and everywhere in the stillness, the Force again began to whisper. Inside the citadel, the air was thick. Every breath felt heavy, like drawing darkness into the lungs. The temple walls pulsed faintly, veins of red light crawling through the stone as if the building itself was alive. Then came the voices, not from ahead, but from within. A Jedi heard his Padawan calling out, begging to be saved. A Sith heard her master's voice, promising forgiveness. Another heard a lover long dead whispering his name. Each sound was perfect, familiar, impossible to ignore, and the deeper they walked, the more the temple changed. Stone gave way to shadow. The corridors curved back on themselves. Every torch became an eye. Phobos had not built this place. She had become it. The Sith drew their blades first. The Jedi followed. But the walls drank their light, and 1,000 red reflections flashing across the surface seemed to move and breathe. They struck at phantoms that bled smoke, at loved ones that screamed when the blades found them, and when all the illusions broke, they found each other's faces beneath the cuts. Fear fed the walls. Every heartbeat made the temple stronger. One by one, the hunters fell. Some turned on their allies, some collapsed in despair. Others simply wandered into the dark, following the voices of those that they had lost until nothing remained but echoes. By the time they reached the heart of the temple, perhaps only 3 still lived. Maybe 2. No one knows for certain. What happened next has never been agreed upon. Some say she waited for them, serene, radiant, unarmed, that she smiled when they entered, and that every thought of violence drained away. That they saw in her not a monster, but something perfect, the beauty of dark made flesh. Others say that she was never there at all, that her voice came from the walls, from the air, from inside their minds, that they fought the sound itself until they realized there was nothing left to strike. And one legend, the oldest, says that there was a single survivor, Jedi or Sith, no one knows for certain. The tale goes that the survivor laid down their weapon, closed their eyes, and faced her. They did not fight, they did not run, they simply refused to fear her. And in that moment, it is said that she starved. The temple went silent, the walls cracked, the lights died. Whether she perished, fled, or ascended beyond flesh, no one can say. Only that when the sun rose over that moon, that the temple was now empty. A single ship left orbit before dawn. Its pilot filed no report, sent no message. The only record left behind were 6 words scrawled into a corrupted data log. She is gone, only for now. The Jedi archived the mission as a victory. The Sith called it purification, but neither ever spoke of it again. Still, for centuries after, both orders recorded the same anomalies. Dreams of a woman with yellow eyes, voices that whispered from the dark during meditation, and the taste of cold sweetness in the mouth when fear took hold. Her cult survived in fragments, hidden cells that never died, only slept. They taught that fear is the only immortal thing, and that whenever fear exists, she does as well. Centuries later, the Jedi turned her legend into a trial. In the lower halls of their temple, initiates were brought before an illusion meant to test the mind. It is known as the Trial of Insight. There, they faced the image of Darth Phobos, not as she was, but as the Force remembered her. She appeared as their greatest fear, their deepest doubt, their secret guilt made flesh. To pass the trial, one had to do what so few ever before could: see through the illusion and refuse to be afraid. The Sith, though, chose a different path. They erased Phobos from their histories entirely. To speak her name was to summon her, and so they buried the memory as they had tried to bury her body. But legends have long memories. They wait in silence. They whisper through cracks in stone and dreams in the dark. Because fear cannot be destroyed. It only ever sleeps, waiting to be felt again. And somewhere beneath the dust of Korriban, a temple of black stone still stands. Its walls still listen. Its shadows still hunger. And in the space between heartbeats, when courage falters and the air turns cold, a voice still whispers through the Force. When Sith have nightmares, I am the face that they see. I am fear itself. And that is the legend of Darth Phobos, the Hidden Fear, a Sith Lord so terrifying that even the Sith themselves turned against her, and one who, according to myth, forced the Jedi and Sith to unite for the first time in recorded history. Now, obviously this story goes a bit deeper than what we officially know. The truth is, Darth Phobos doesn't have much written about her in Legends, unfortunately. She was first introduced in The Force Unleashed, mostly as a trial simulation in the Jedi Temple section. From there though, the lore gives us fragments, hints that she was a Thelan, that she manipulated minds, that she was killed after waging a war between Jedi and Sith that forced the two orders to unite to stop her fear. We wanted to take the skeleton that already existed and fill in the missing pieces, to imagine what kind of monster could drive both sides of the Force to pure panic. So yes, we definitely punched this one up for Halloween, but I think that's the best way to celebrate a character like Darth Phobos. She's meant to be part nightmare, part myth, and part reflection of what the dark side really is. Not just anger or hate, but fear itself. Even if most of the story is legend, the bones of it are real. And in a galaxy built on myth and memory, sometimes it's the legends that tell us more than the history books ever could. There are few figures in Star Wars as haunting as the Emperor's personal guard, the crimson-clad Royal Guard, the silent Sovereign Protectors, and the black-armored Shadow Guard. Each of them was terrifying in their own right, symbols of Palpatine's power and his obsession with loyalty. But standing apart from all of them is something stranger, something more grotesque. The Imperial Sentinels. These were not men chosen for loyalty. They were not elite soldiers elevated through training. They were not ambitious Force adepts clawing their way to power. The Sentinels were engineered from the ground up, cloned in secret facilities, mutated by alchemy, and stripped of will before they could even form unique identities. They were never meant to be individuals. They were never meant to be human. They were half-finished experiments, a halfway perfected attempt from Palpatine to forge a race of living statues who would embody his will. And where they stood tells us everything. Greetings again, Acolytes and Lore Junkies, and welcome back to the channel and the archives. Today, we will be finishing our look at the Imperial Royal Guards, with the most terrifying group of them all, the Imperial Sentinels from the world of Biss. The Sentinels were not stationed on Coruscant where the Emperor paraded his Crimson Guards before the Senate and the galaxy at large. They were stationed on Biss, Palpatine's true throne world. The world where his clone bodies were grown, where the dark side compendium was written, where his most prized secrets and treasures were stored. Biss was not the public face of the Empire, but it was the hidden heart of it. And there, at the core of Sidious's power, the Sentinels stood as his watchers. This is the story of the Imperial Sentinels, half-complete monsters, grotesque guardians, and perhaps the most unsettling creations of Darth Sidious's reign. Part 1. Their origins in alchemy and in science. The origins of the Imperial Sentinels are unlike any other guard class in Palpatine's service. The Royal Guard were elite stormtroopers and soldiers, conditioned to absolute loyalty. The Sovereign Protectors were chosen for their skill, and sometimes even their potential in the Force. Even the Shadow Guards, black-clad assassins with lightsaber pikes, were born men, trained, indoctrinated, and erased until their voices were gone. But the Sentinels are different. They were not born. They were grown. Deep within the secret cloning facility of the world of Biss, tissue stock was used to begin their growth. During their gestation, chemicals were introduced that suppressed higher brain functions, speech, independence, imagination, even the ability to resist orders. These chemicals created blank slates, beings who could move, fight, and obey, but who would never think for themselves. And on top of this, dark-side adepts performed alchemy, mutating and growing clones into hulking giants. This alone sets the Sentinels apart from the other classes of the guards. Sith alchemy was an art of the ancient Sith, used to twist flesh, forge monsters, and to bind the dark side into unnatural vessels. In the era of the Rule of Two, it was almost unheard of. Darth Bane had dismissed it largely. Sidious himself usually relied on politics, apprentices, and his mastery in other methods of the Force. But the Sentinels were proof that he indulged in alchemy directly, and the results are disturbing ones. His cultists attempted to create mental bonds with their Sentinels, tying them to their will. If the process succeeded, the Sentinels became a living puppet, utterly reliant on its master for purpose and direction. If it failed, the creature was destroyed instantly. Rumors circulated even among the adepts that the first generation of Sentinels had been cloned from Force-sensitive stock. the early versions were immensely powerful, but unstable to the point of madness. Their sensitivity to the dark side clashed with their chemical suppression, creating insane hulks that could not be controlled. Later generations were deliberately dulled, stripped of whatever force potentials their predecessors had possessed. This made them far weaker, but manageable. In this sense, the Sentinels were always incomplete. They were halfway successes, terrifying in presence, but flawed in design, never perfected. They were a glimpse at what Palpatine wanted, an army of alchemical soldiers bred for loyalty. But what they also were was a reminder of his limits. Now we reach part 2, their history. The Sentinels' history spans the final days of the Republic through the last moments of Palpatine's reborn Dark Empire, but their appearances are always rare, always shrouded in secrecy and importance. Their first appearance was as early as 19 BBY in the Purge of Ashgaboda. Their first known deployment came at the dawn of the Empire, during the Great Jedi Purge. On an unnamed planet, several Jedi had been captured. Among them was the Jedi Master Ashgaboda, a member of the Librarians' Assembly. The Sentinels appeared at the battlefield carrying authentic Imperial data chips. They took custody of Boda, loaded him onto their dungeon ship, and brought him to Coruscant. There, Palpatine had Boda tortured and then executed. But what mattered most was what Boda carried, the Tedran holocron. This holocron contained the wisdom of the ancients, Jedi Masters, and Palpatine used it to compose the Book of Anger, the first volume of his dark side compendium. In this way, the Imperial Sentinels are directly tied to one of the most infamous works of Sith philosophy in galactic history. Then we reach the early Imperial era, the Sarlacc Project. First-generation Sentinels were also stationed aboard the Golan defense platform guarding a Super Star Destroyer prototype above the world of Biss. They were stationed at the so-called Sarlacc Project. Alderaanian resistance agents who infiltrated the station confronted the Sentinels in Docking Bay 616, learning firsthand what these giants were capable of. And then we reach 2 BBY, their early sightings. As of 2 BBY, the Sentinels are still rarely seen outside of Biss. But occasionally, they did make public appearances, usually transporting Force users in custody. These brief sightings created wild rumors within the Imperial courts. Some whispered that the Sentinels were cyborgs or droids. Others claimed that they were remnants of a giant species enslaved by Palpatine. Some even speculated that they were rebels who had dared to defy the Emperor, transformed into hulks as punishment for their crime. And then comes the Galactic Civil War. Rumors and whispers within the rebellion. Rumors of the Sentinels spread like ghost stories. Giant armored warriors who stood at the Emperor's side, his most terrifying enforcers. But few had ever seen them, and fewer still had survived. 10 years after the Battle of Yavin, the Dark Empire. It was not until Palpatine's rebirth on Biss that the Sentinels were unleashed more openly. During Operation Shadowhand, they were seen guarding the Emperor's citadel, patrolling cloning facilities, and working alongside Imperial Dungeoneers on dungeon ships. It was during this time that Luke Skywalker, after defecting to Palpatine, would even breed 2 Sentinels of his own. These hulks would escort Han Solo, Leia Organa, and C-3PO to Palpatine's personal clone labs, where they attempted to rescue Luke. When one of the Sentinels restrained Han, Leia ignited her lightsaber and severed the creature's hand. It did not scream. It simply obeyed until it was destroyed. 11 years after the Battle of Yavin and the fall of Biss, the Sentinel's fate was tied to Biss itself. When R2-D2 sabotaged the hyperdrive of the Eclipse II, sending it crashing into the Galaxy Gun, the resulting misfire destroyed the world of Biss. With it went Palpatine's cloning facilities, his hidden empire, and the Sentinels. Most of them were obliterated, erased with the world that they had been built to protect and serve. But what of their powers and abilities? The terror of the Sentinels was not only their story, it is what they were. They were gargantuan, twice the height and strength of any ordinary man, towering even above the Emperor's Crimson Elite guards. Their sheer size made them capable of overpowering almost any opponent through brute force alone. Their primary weapons were massive vibro axes, sized to match their bulk. They also carried blasters when needed. Despite their size though, they were trained in unarmed martial arts, and even beast riding. Further proof that they were meant to function as more than just statues. They wore heavy battle armor beneath long reddish-purple cloaks emblazoned with golden designs. Their helmets concealed their faces entirely, revealing only glowing red eyes. No flesh was ever visible. This gave them the appearance of living statues, faceless, unyielding. What made them most unnatural, though, was their alchemical alterations. Through Sith sorcery, their bodies were warped, their minds were blanked. Rumors held that adepts could even see through their eyes, making them literal extensions of their masters. But here lies the greatest uncertainty. Were they Force users? The truth is complicated. The earliest generations of the Sentinels may very well have been. Their raw connection to the dark side made them dangerously unstable, but later versions were deliberately dulled. They had no conscious mastery of the Force. Instead, they existed as Force perversions, bodies twisted by alchemy, saturated in corruption, radiating the dark side but not wielding it per se. In a sense, they were terrifying not because of what they could do, but because of what they represented. They were empty vessels touched by the Force, proof of Palpatine's desire to create life not for the sake of life, but for the sake of obedience and the glorification of self. To be a Sith was to subscribe to the worship of self. The Sentinels were not for display though. They were not for ceremony. They were stationed exclusively on Biss, where Palpatine was at his most vulnerable. They stood guard over the Citadel, his cloning facilities, his personal labs. Some even protected restricted areas of the Imperial Palace on Coruscant, but they also functioned as escorts for Palpatine's adepts. Whenever one of his inner circle was dispatched on a high-priority mission, Sentinels would accompany them off-world. Their presence was both protective and symbolic, a sign that the adepts spoke with the Emperor's authority. But above all, they were symbols of fear. Their sheer size, their silence, their facelessness, all of it made them more terrifying than stormtroopers, more unnerving than inquisitors. They were the mute hulks of Biss, rarely seen, never explained, and always lethal. So with all of that said, how did the Imperial Sentinels really stack up against Palpatine's other guards? This is one of our favorite thought exercises when we look at all of the guards. To answer that, we need to place them in the larger lineage of elite warriors who served the Emperor. From the mercenary Sun Guard, to the Crimson Royal Guard, to the black-clad Shadow Guard, all the way to the Sovereign Protectors. Each rung of the pyramid represented a refinement of loyalty, power, and skill. At the base, the Sun Guards of Taris, mercenaries whose discipline and martial prowess first inspired Palpatine's model for the elite guards. The Sun Guards who had fanatically followed his own master Darth Plagueis. Above them, the Imperial Royal Guard, handpicked from the Emperor's best soldiers, trained on Yin Chor, and molded into silent Crimson Sentinels of loyalty. Then came the Shadow Guards, Royal Guards with Force sensitivity, their identities broken away and their voices erased, armed with lightsaber pikes to hunt Jedi and to silence darkside rivals. At its peak, the Sovereign Protectors, Palpatine's most elite guardians, stationed on Biss itself, not all wielders of the Force, but some like Karnor Jax, powerful enough to receive formal training from the Sith. And then you have the Imperial Sentinels. They do not sit neatly inside of this pyramid. They weren't men elevated to higher service. They were grown as grotesque creations, engineered husks clad in ceremonial armor, lacking the finesse of the Sovereigns, the speed of the Shadows, and even the tactical minds of the Crimson Guards. What they possessed was something entirely different, a terrifying absence of will. But what makes them terrifying is not what they were, but what they may have become. In their final form, the Sovereign Protectors clearly stood above all of them in skill and refinement. But the Sentinels were the only guard Force engineered from conception, born not as men, but as husks sculpted by alchemy. If Palpatine had perfected this process, stabilizing Force sensitivity, fusing their immense physical strength with true mastery of the dark side, the Sentinels could have eclipsed every other guard by a huge margin. Imagine an entire corps of towering giants, loyal from birth, wielding the Force with the same tireless obedience that they already embodied. No ambition, no betrayal, no hesitation. Only the Emperor's will given flesh. It never came to pass. They remained incomplete, destroyed on Biss. But in their shadow lingers the nightmare of their potential. A glimpse at what Palpatine truly desired. An army not of men, but of monsters. Monsters who would have stood as the ultimate guardians of the eternal empire. What I find most interesting about the Imperial Sentinels is how they weren't just a late Dark Empire creation. At least some of them were already around in the early days of the Empire, tied directly to Ashka Boda and the Tedran Holocron. That means Palpatine was experimenting with these alchemical giants almost from the very beginning, likely even when he was the Supreme Chancellor, the humble Palpatine. They serve as a reminder of how fascinating the lore in the world of Biss is also. Palpatine's true throne, steeped in secrets, clone vats, and darkside corruption. Biss is unique in Star Wars because it's not just another fortress world, it was the Emperor's hidden heart. I like the idea of the Sentinels being the final stop of the Guardsman ladder, the grotesque endpoint of the Sun Guards, the Royal Guards, the Shadow Guards, and the Sovereign Protectors. But the truth is that they failed. They were incomplete experiments, and the Sovereign Protectors remained the clear number one in Palpatine's hierarchy. If the two ever matched against each other, I think the outcome is clear. A Sentinel's sheer size and strength might overwhelm an opponent at first, but the Sovereign Protectors' refined skill, and in the case of Karnor Jax, the use of the dark side, would cut them down. The Sentinels were terrifying in presence, but the Sovereigns were perfected. In the end, the Sentinels stand as one of the strangest footnotes of Palpatine's empire, half-finished monsters whose legacy lies not in what they achieved, but in the haunting glimpse of what they could have become. Emperor Palpatine has a problem with staying dead. After his death on the second Death Star, the galaxy heaved a sigh of relief, but only a mere 6 years later he would return in the form of a younger clone body, commanding a new dark empire from his throne world of Biss. It required Luke temporarily embracing the dark side, and then the combined strength of both Skywalker siblings to ultimately defeat Sidious once and for all. Or at least so they thought. Darth Sidious would return one more time through a broken down and a decrepit clone body. Sidious was vanquished for the last time when he attempted to take the infant Anakin Solo's body, only to be repelled by the Skywalkers. But there was a hidden factor to this ultimate downfall, a secret enemy that not even Palpatine himself knew of or could have predicted. The real cause behind his demise was one of his own royal guards. And not just any royal guard, but a sovereign protector, the best of the best, the ones who were the most loyal to him in all of the Empire. And trust us, this isn't clickbait either. In today's Holocron, we're going to discuss the villainous machinations of Karnor Jax, the Emperor's true murderer. Most interestingly, Karnor Jax got his start as the son of a Tyresian Sun Guard. They were the men who came before the Royal Guard, the inspiration behind them. The Sun Guard had faithfully served Sidious's own master Darth Plagueis, before falling into his own service following Plagueis' death. Jax's father was executed by Sidious for failing to recover an ancient Sith holocron. It seemed as though Karnor Jax had his destiny laid out before him from the very beginning. Later in life, Jax would join the Stormtrooper Corps, but he proved to be so efficient that he was elevated to becoming a Shadow Trooper. These were the elite stealth units who wore black armor and served under the Black Hole, the Imperial Intelligence Director. Even there, he stood out amongst his peers, and was so selected to go through the training of a Royal Guard. One of the secrets behind his success, though, was that Jax was Force sensitive, using the Force to augment his movements in a more rudimentary way, but it was enough for him to excel to just about any kind of physical training that he undertook. He went through the same training that all the Royal Guards go through. He'd be sent to Yinchor, where he was taught the most dangerous fighting systems in the galaxy, including the lethal Ichani martial art. Although he received training in all manner of weaponry, he specialized in the double vibroblade, which is the most iconic weapon of the Royal Guards. While there, he and the other trainees tested their mettle in the Squall, a fighting arena where they often had to duel one another to severe injury or even death. In the arena, Jax regularly fought and won against another trainee by the name of Kurkanos. But of course, Jax's inherent Force sensitivity gave him an edge. As the initial number of recruits dwindled to a much smaller one, the remaining men were put into pairs in order to learn how to rely on their brothers for support. The trials and training took a drastic step up at this point, so that the pairs would be forced to rely on each other to complete the tasks that were set before them. Jax was paired with another recruit whom he never fully respected, and despite their inability to work together on the level of some of the other pairings, Jax and his partner were able to become one of the last two pairs to survive the training. The other pairing was Kurkanos and another trainee, but their final test and graduation consisted of the pairings each presenting themselves before the Emperor and being commanded to fight their brother to the death. This was the ultimate test of loyalty and a test of skill. For Karnor Jax, it wasn't a difficult task at all. He executed his training brother with ease and without hesitation, and was elevated to the position of a Royal Guard. Kurkanos did the same, and both were elevated, feeding more into their rivalry. The years would pass and Jax would serve the Emperor faithfully. Yet, he may have been the only Royal Guard who was not indoctrinated with undying loyalty. The only one. The other guards had an almost cultist worship of their master Palpatine, believing him to be their life and their breath. But Jax, this was not true for him. His ambitions and desire for more personal power overrode any brainwashing and conditioning that the Empire administered. Jax knew that he was destined for greatness, but was biding his time, learning. Apparently during this time, he also managed to keep his Force sensitivity a secret. Either that or he was unaware of his true power. But no matter the reason, Palpatine never discovered his sensitivity, and so he never joined the Shadow Guards. This of course may have saved his life in the end, as he was not one of the guards present during the Battle of Endor, and he also didn't have his mind erased as most Shadow Guards did. With the destruction of the second Death Star, Palpatine had been officially defeated. Carnor Jax had been on Coruscant, and when news of Sidious's death reached his ears, Sate Pestage became the acting Emperor. Jax's path in life would change when the former Emperor's hand, Lady Lumaya, requested a detachment of the Royal Guard. Lumaya was one of the only hands to receive actual Sith training from Lord Vader. Devastated by his death, Lumaya declared herself a Dark Lady of the Sith and desired to continue the Sith lineage. When she received Jax as a part of her requested unit, she immediately recognized his potential in the Force and scouted him for official Sith training. Carnor accepted, seeing that this was finally the avenue for greater power that he had always desired. He would receive formal Sith training as a true apprentice, though with only the knowledge that Lumaya had. She was far from a proper Sith Lord, but at least she had the training from Vader and was currently searching for more Sith holocrons for enlightenment. Together, the two of them made large plans to take over the Empire, and that began with weeding out what remained of Palpatine's influence. They journeyed on to the world of Bostrida and systematically executed the prophets of the dark side. This was a Sith-adjacent cult devoted only to Sidious that continued to rule the Empire in his image. Lumaya then faded into the shadows, however, choosing to work in the background and to have her apprentice be the face of their operation. As a royal guard, Jax carried a significant amount of weight in the realm of Imperial politics, and under his master's direction, he infiltrated the Imperial ruling council, forming an alliance with Sarkev Quest. This was yet another one of the Emperor's hands who had integrated into the Imperial Council in order to spy on Palpatine's political enemies. He too wished to rule the Empire, and saw this as a golden opportunity. Using his influence, he backed Lord Jax as a potential figurehead for the throne, as Emperor. And so, the alliance of these darkside wielders began manipulating their way through the Imperial remnant, ascending closer to the throne. However, a massive wrench was thrown in their plan when Sidious emerged once more. Having used the ancient technique of essence transfer, Sidious had survived the Death Star and went into one of his clone bodies on Biss. Deep in the core, Palpatine revealed himself leading a brand new regime, a regime that he called the Dark Empire. He had barely any interest in the squabbling pieces of his former empire, spending the last 6 years letting them destroy themselves against the New Republic. This was all to test the strength of the New Republic before he made his own attack, and now that he was back, Sidious was unleashing his fleets, war machines, and superweapons left and right. For the first time, Sidious became a warlord. Without having to cover up his true power, the new Emperor was fleeing the dark side of the Force at his enemies with wild abandon and pure aggression. Lumaya, Quest, and Carnor Jax all decided that in order for their plans for power to succeed though, they needed to undermine and ultimately destroy Palpatine. They knew that going against him publicly would be a death sentence. Many of the Imperial remnants were flocking to his leadership, and the Dark Empire was simply too powerful to fight in the open. But Jax knew exactly how to take care of his old master. After all, he was still a royal guard. Carnor Jax returned to Palpatine's service and was elevated to a sovereign protector. This was a better position than he could have ever hoped for. He was now even closer to Sidious and was able to spy on his secrets. Not only this, but the new black armor with the red accents fit the Dark Lord persona quite well, and Jax began to believe that he was destined to become the Emperor. Meeting to secure support for Jax's plan were treated with the utmost security. Any person that disagreed with his treachery or anyone that acted as though they would reveal a plan to Sidious were immediately killed. There were a few close calls even, but due to Jax's loyal second-in-command, the traitors were dealt with. Meanwhile, the undercover Jax would discover how the Emperor had survived and how he was keeping himself alive. The clone bodies were the key, and there were dozens of them. Jax then requested an extremely large sum of credits from Quest, who would secure them by embezzlement from the Imperial ruling council. Using the funds, Jax bribed the Emperor's personal physician to sabotage the clone bodies, making them all unstable. The clone vessels were unable to handle Palpatine's incredible strength in the Force, and it was rapidly aging and deteriorating them, forcing him to search for brand new vessels or hop in between them. His final defeat came on Onderon when he attempted to seize the infant Anakin Solo's body for his own. but he was too weak to use his powers at full to defend himself against the Jedi. Due to the brave sacrifice of an Order 66 survivor, Palpatine was finally destroyed, and in the process, Karnor Jax had avenged his father. So in a poetic way, there were several people whom Palpatine wronged that had a hand in his demise. And that is how Karnor Jax, the Emperor's most trusted royal guard, ended up being the true reason behind his death. But Jax's story doesn't end here. He indeed ascended to the throne and became the new Emperor for a time. However, he had made a deadly oversight. The bride position was captured by the New Republic, and eventually revealed his betrayal against the Emperor, including the name of the man who had bribed him. Hiding in the shadows of the interrogation room, a lone royal guard heard the confession and rushed back to Yinchor where the remaining royal guards were in mourning. If this information were to leak, not only would the guard hunt him down, but Karnor Jax's claim to the throne would be overturned by a furious Imperial ruling council. To cover his mistake, Jax made a drastic choice and sent a legion of stormtroopers to annihilate all of the remaining royal guards. The troopers poured in the facility of Yinchor, and although the royal guards were able to kill hundreds of them, they could not hold out against the forces that came in endless waves. Only a single royal guard survived, and that of course would be Jax's old rival, Kur Kanos. Lord Jax was infuriated, knowing that Kur alone had the elite skill and the intel to completely destroy his rule. He had already planned on crushing the New Republic, but now he had to put these plans on hold to hunt down the last of the guard. He ordered a massive bounty on Kanos' head, as well as sending an elite detachment of forces dedicated to finding the guard. As the story plays out, Kur Kanos would ally himself with the rebels and fight off Jax's empire. Kur Kanos never intended on joining them and kept his allegiance to the memory of Palpatine and his dead brothers. However, his brainwashing would finally break down with the more time that he spent with the rebel leader, Mirith Sin. Jax would even find and torture Sin to bring Kanos to him. Ultimately though, it was Kur Kanos who got the upper hand, as he lured the Dark Lord to the place that had birthed their rivalry, the arena, the squall on Yinchor. There, the two finally faced off in an epic climactic duel. Karnor Jax's force abilities gave him the advantage, and he would even play a dirty trick by having an Imperial sniper set up far away just in case he failed. However, the showdown was spoiled when the rebel forces arrived. Mirith had done so both to help Kanos and to bring Jax to justice. Kanos was able to triumph over his rival, but problems arose when Sin wanted to arrest Jax and have him face a New Republic trial. This conflicted with Kanos' oath to kill him, and so in a brutal and a controversial decision to honor Sidious and his fallen brothers, Kur Kanos executed Karnor Jax. As his vibroblade pierced the chest of the Dark Lord Karnor Jax, Kur Kanos' final words to him were this: "Thus die all traitors." The story of Karnor Jax and Kur Kanos is told in the Crimson Empire comics, and personally, I highly recommend them. Crimson Empire 1 is only 5 issues and definitely worth a read. It's a very interesting peek into a galaxy that sort of finds itself in ruins following the Galactic Civil War, from the perspective of a royal guard. The New Republic is still reeling from the Dark Empire crisis, and we get a nice tight story told between two rivals. Along with this is a never-before-seen insight into the royal guards themselves. There is a fortress buried beneath centuries of silence, not destroyed in war, not scorched by the light of a Jedi blade, but undone from within. Its halls, once adorned with Sith sigils, now lie cold and hollow, the stone charred and fractured by fire. It is a tomb, not of bodies, but of knowledge. No Jedi ever breached its gates, and no Sith dared to ever return, because what occurred within was not a collapse, but it was a purge, an execution of legacy, a self-inflicted wound that would bleed through centuries of Sith history. And at the heart of it stood a man calling himself Darth Gravid. Darth Gravid was a Sith Lord, a scholar, a heretic, and he nearly destroyed the very order that he swore to perfect. He called his doctrine the unifying path, a vision so radical, so blasphemous, that it drove him to destroy countless holocrons, artifacts, and rituals, not in rage, not in madness alone, but rather in faith. Gravid believed that the dark side was incomplete, that the Sith and their obsession with control and domination had lost everything vital to them, and he sought to fill that void with the very thing that they had sworn to oppose, with the light. What he attempted was not corruption, it was synthesis, an impossible reconciliation of opposites, a new vision of power through balance, and in doing that, he brought the Sith to the edge of extinction. Darth Gravid lived around 533 BBY, nearly 3 centuries after Darth Bane first established the Rule of Two. By this point in the history of the Sith, the Baneite lineage had solidified into something cold and methodical, a hidden war of succession, where knowledge was hoarded, power was passed down like a blade, and survival meant everything. But Darth Gravid was different. Where others sought strength through cruelty, he saw understanding. Where others sharpened their hatred, he studied. He was not the product of wrath, he was the product of doubt. He immersed himself in Jedi texts, not as an enemy, but rather as a student. He questioned the foundations of the dark side, and slowly, obsessively, he began to craft a brand new philosophy. He named it the Unifying Path. It was not simply a blending of Jedi and Sith teachings. This was something far more dangerous, the belief that true power came from embracing both light and dark, compassion and passion, restraint and fury, serenity and ambition. Gravid envisioned an order that could transcend the dichotomy of the Force, but the Force does not reward contradiction, it punishes. To walk between the light and the dark is to stand on the blade's edge, but cut from both sides. As Gravid delved deeper into his vision, his connection to the Force began to fracture. The dark side, sensing his hesitation, recoiled from him. The light, sensing his corruption, refused him. In reaching for balance, he became imbalanced. His meditations turned to obsession. His thoughts spiraled into fragmentation. His identity snapped. And worst of all, he began to lose his faith in the very foundation of the Sith tradition. In secret, he constructed a bastion. There he hoarded the greatest repository of Sith knowledge seen since the fall of the Old Republic. Rituals from the Golden Age, doctrines of alchemy, forbidden techniques scrawled in the margins of holocrons passed down from the Dark Lords of old. And at the center of it all, he guarded one power above all others: essence transfer. It was the lost ritual. Essence transfer was the closest thing the Sith had come to immortality, a technique that allowed a dark side spirit to leap from one body to another, defying death through sheer will. It was first discovered in the ancient era by Darth and Deddu, later mastered by Vitiate, and obsessively pursued by Darth Bane in his final days. But Gravid may have perfected it. Some believe he uncovered fragments of Deddu's original teachings, pieces that Bane never found, and that Palpatine would spend a lifetime trying to recover. If the stories are true, then Gravid held in his hands the last complete pathway to Sith immortality, and then he destroyed it. The ritual of essence transfer was not lost to time, it was lost to flame. In Gravid's efforts to purify the Sith, he consigned their greatest secret to oblivion. Sidious centuries later would clone body after body in a desperate attempt to reconstruct what had already been burned by the hands of a man who believed that he was saving the Sith. As his obsession deepened, Gravid sealed himself within his stronghold. He raised force barriers around his bastion, isolating himself from the galaxy and from the Sith Order itself. Within those walls he began the Purge. One by one, holocrons were shattered, scrolls reduced to cinders, relics consigned to fire. The knowledge of worlds, the legacy of empires, gone. And then came another, Darth Jean, his apprentice, his shadow. She had not been taught these deep rituals. Gravid and his spiral withheld them, believing she too may be corrupted by the path that he had already begun to transcend. But Jean was no acolyte. She was trained in pain, raised in the crucible of the Rule of Two, and what she found behind those barriers was not enlightenment, it was betrayal. A Sith Lord who had turned his blade inward, a master who had destroyed their inheritance, a heretic burning the legacy of Bane to ashes, all in a pursuit of doctrine that had never belonged in the darkness. And so she did what a true Sith apprentice must. She challenged him. She breached the barriers. Darth Jean, the apprentice raised in the shadows of the Rule of Two, carved her way through the outer defenses of the bastion with fury and purpose. The fortress had once been a sanctum of power. Now it reeked of smoke, scorched parchment, and ritual fire. The air inside was thick with ash. The walls wept heat from weeks of quiet destruction. She moved through now a graveyard of power and of the inheritance that she deserved, her history. The holocrons were gone, shattered, burned. The scrolls unspooled into flame. Relics of unspeakable potency smashed against the stone. What had once been the most complete collection of Sith knowledge since the fall of the ancient empire had now all been reduced to a funeral pyre. At the center of it all stood her master. Darth Gravid turned slowly to face her, his robes tattered, his face pale, hollow. He was not armed, not in the traditional sense. His lightsaber hung at his waist, untouched. His eyes did not burn with hatred or fear. They burned with certainty. "I knew you would come," he said, "and I hoped. I prayed that you would see what I have seen." Darth Jean did not speak. She did not need to. Her silence was a blade, her stance her verdict. "The Sith are broken," Gravid whispered. "We build legacies of pain only to see them crumble in fire and betrayal. The Jedi, they fear emotion. We worship it. Both are incomplete, but together we could become something more." He gestured to the flames around him, to the blackened remains of the Sith power centuries old. "I destroyed this to make space for the future." Jean stepped forward. "You destroyed everything." And that is when the duel began. Gravid ignited his lightsaber first, not out of aggression but necessity. His style was like anything Jean had ever faced before. He moved like a man unbound from fear, casting aside the rigid ferocity of the Sith lightsaber combat for something slower, more fluid. An echo of Form 6, almost meditative. But behind that grace was power, terrifying, overwhelming power. Even fractured in spirit, even isolated from the full strength of the Force, Darth Gravid fought with the fury of someone who had trained alone in silence, sharpening himself not for survival, but for revelation. Jean, by contrast, fought with the raw, unfiltered brutality of the Bainite lineage. There was no elegance, there was no restraint. Her blow struck hard, fast, and with lethal intention. She wasn't trying to teach her master a lesson, she was trying to kill him. Sparks lit the chamber like flashes of memory, each one illuminating the ruins of a history lost forever. They fought atop the ashes of Endedu's rituals, between the cinders of Sith alchemy, near the hollow plinth where the last essence transfer scroll had turned to smoke. But still Gravid endured. "You still do not see it," he hissed. "We could be more than Sith. We could be whole." But even as he spoke, his movements grew erratic. His footwork staggered. The fractures in his ideology were manifesting in his combat. Hesitation clashing with instinct. Serenity interrupting rage. He struck with a Jedi's precision one moment, and a Sith savagery the next. He was slowly becoming nothing. The turning point came not with a strike, but with a severing. Gravid landed a clean blow, arcing his lightsaber across Jean's left side in a vicious vertical slash. The blade bit deep, searing through her shoulder, arm, face, and chest. Flesh burned, blood hissed. Her scream echoed off the stone. She fell to her knees, unarmed, mutilated, broken. But she did not yield. There was no plea, no retreat, no surrender. "You destroyed the Sith," she rasped. "Now I will destroy you." And with that she rose. No lightsaber, no tactic, purpose. Jean threw herself forward, disarming Gravid with a burst of raw, violent power. Her pain had become a weapon, her fury unrestrained. She struck him with no elegance but with desperation, with grief, and with betrayal. And in the end, Darth Jean killed him, not with the lightsaber, but with her hands. Gravid collapsed to the floor, eyes wide, not in fear, but in recognition. "You understand now," was the last thing he ever said. His apprentice did not answer. Jean stood over his body, her own ruined, her skin scorched, one arm hanging in shreds, but still she stood. In this moment, Darth Jean was not a victim, she was not a survivor, she was Sith. That was not a victory born of strength, it was born of sacrifice. Gravid, even with his broken connection, had nearly destroyed her. Had he embraced the dark side fully, he may have annihilated her without effort. Had he surrendered to the light, he may have become one of the wisest Jedi Masters of his age. But he chose neither, and the Force had abandoned him. His failure proved a truth older than the rule of two. The Sith cannot be balanced. They exist in opposition to the natural order. The dark side thrives in distortion, in extremes. The Jedi flow with that current though. The Sith attempt to twist it. To reach for both is to drown. The legacy left behind from this duel cannot be overstated. I would even go as far as to call it the greatest duel of the rule of two. With Gravid's death came the loss of untold power, The technique of essence transfer, known, studied, perhaps perfected, vanished in flame. What Bane had chased, what Sidious would later dedicate his entire life to reclaiming, was destroyed in a single generation. The rituals of mass sacrifice, the secrets of the Sith spirit binding, the ancient alchemy of the Golden Age, the voices of the Dark Lords who spoke through talismans and holocrons, all of them gone. And Darth Jean, the woman who preserved the rule of two, would carry her scars forever. Some say she replaced her lost limbs and organs with Sith technology, augmenting herself until pain became power. Others say she lived out only to train a successor, and then died of her injuries. Darth Plagueis believed the latter, but one thing is certain. Without Darth Jean, the Sith would have died at that fortress. Without her pain, there would be no Darth Sidious, no Vader, no Empire. She was the hidden pillar of the Sith's future, a mutilated sentinel standing in the ashes of the past. The fortress fell silent. Its walls, once brimming with the echoes of power, stood hollow. The holocrons were gone. The scrolls were smoke. The ancient tongues that once whispered through the halls no longer spoke. Darth Gravid was dead. Darth Jean, scarred, broken, but victorious, emerged from the ruins not as a survivor, not as a conqueror, but as a vessel for pain, for survival, and for the rule of two. But what she preserved came at the cost of the Sith would never fully recover, because Gravid didn't just die in that fortress, he took nearly everything with him. The Sith have always been defined by their relationship with power, not only in its pursuit, but in how they preserve it, through their rituals, their relics, sorcery, and alchemy. Knowledge to the Sith is as sacred as dominance. Without it, there is no ascension, no legacy, no continuity. And yet Gravid deliberately, methodically erased centuries of that legacy. Among the rituals destroyed in this purge were some of the darkest, most potent, and most elusive powers that the Sith ever uncovered. Let's break down exactly what was lost and the consequences of it. Obviously, essence transfer, the apex of immortality for the Sith. First discovered by Darth and Deddu, essence transfer allowed the Sith to project their consciousness into a new host, bypassing death entirely through sheer strength of will. It was more than survival, it was actual continuity, a means by which a Sith could live through generations, expanding their empires across lifetimes. Bane pursued the technique obsessively, attempting to transfer his spirit into his apprentice Zana. Vitiate, known later as Valkorion, many believe perfected it. He didn't just use it, he thrived on it. Leaping from body to body across centuries, Vitiate ruled over multiple empires in multiple identities. Through essence transfer, he essentially became a god. Sidious generations later would attempt to reclaim this lost art. He would pour vast resources into cloning, into body preservation, into Sith artifacts and hidden vaults, searching for a ritual that Gravid had already possessed. It was said that Gravid had accessed teachings from Deddu's own lineage, hints, fragments, perhaps even the full ritual itself. Not theory, not legend, practice, and that he destroyed it. Look at it like this. What Palpatine would spend a lifetime failing to reconstruct, Darth Gravid erased in an instant. This act alone made him one of the greatest failures in Sith history. But he didn't just stop there. The rituals of mass sacrifice came next. The ancient Sith were practitioners of large-scale sacrificial rituals, ceremonies that trained the life force of entire populations to fuel apocalyptic powers. Lords like Naga Sadow, Exar Kun, and Vitiate wielded these rituals without hesitation. These were not battlefield techniques, they were planetary incantations, designed to ravage worlds, summon entities, and empower a single Sith beyond comprehension. By the time of Bane, these practices had already faded from memory. But Gravid in his studies had reconstructed what many believed to be portions of it, recovered fragments from the holocrons of Sadow and Ragnos, rituals that drew a collective suffering, turning death into fuel. Those too were thrown to the fire. He also destroyed spirit anchoring and Sith object binding. One of the hallmarks of the ancient Sith Lords was their ability to anchor their spirits to objects, holocrons, tombs, and talismans. This form of pseudo-immortality allowed their consciousness to endure even after death. Karnus Mur, Zozan, and Deddu each demonstrated variations of this technique, binding their essence to artifacts that would haunt generations to come. But in the era of the Rule of Two, these powers are conspicuously absent. We see no true spirit-bound Sith, no essence-possessed objects, no haunted temples speaking with the voices of the dead. It's not because the rituals were myth, it's because Gravid destroyed it. Then he also destroyed alchemy and transmutation. The ancient Sith could warp biology, they could twist flesh, shaping beasts, creating monstrous Sith spawn through using dark side science and force incantation. The likes of Sadao, Kun, and Ragnos wielded these arts with terrifying ease. And while it's true traces of alchemy survived in the later eras, most notably in Darth Plagueis and Darth Sidious's experiments, true Sith alchemy was never again seen at the scale practiced in the Old Empire. Gravid had restored pieces of it, and then he incinerated it. We learned that before he destroyed it all, he was essentially a great collector of this knowledge, a completionist in many ways. And this is where I think the story gets really haunting, because Darth Sidious, often viewed as the culmination of the Rule of Two, was in many ways a restorationist. He was a scavenger, a Sith whose power was immense, and all of it was spent rebuilding what had already been lost. Sidious's obsession with temples, his relentless pursuit of ancient holocrons, his creation of clones, vessels, and Sith libraries, all of it stems from a single truth. Palpatine did not inherit a complete legacy. He inherited the ruins left behind by Gravid. Everything that Sidious did, every experiment, every corrupted artifact, every dark side excavation, was an attempt to reclaim what should have been passed down naturally. Instead, he built an empire on fragments, on echoes, and even with all of his power, he never found what Gravid had destroyed. This is why so many fans, and even characters in the lore itself, believe that the ancient Sith were more powerful than their successors. It's not just mythologizing, it's reality. The ancient Sith wielded knowledge that allowed them to reshape life, defy death, to dominate through presence alone. Their power wasn't in lightsaber techniques or clever manipulation, it was in ritual mastery, in domination over the Force. The Rule of Two, by contrast, became more refined, but less esoteric, more focused, but less cosmic. They were clever, dangerous, and efficient, but they no longer played with the same metaphysical fire, because that fire had been put out by their own. There is only one figure in Sith history who mirrors Gravid's descent. That's Darth Traya. Like Gravid, Traya saw the Force as a prison. She questioned the binary between Jedi and Sith, believing that both were flawed reflections of a greater truth. She had also descended into heresy, abandoning dogma in pursuit of philosophical freedoms. But where Traya turned her hatred towards the Force itself, Gravid sought reconciliation with it. He didn't hate the Jedi, he didn't despise the Sith. He desired to unify them. He genuinely believed that serenity and passion could coexist, that empathy could enhance power, that balance was not the enemy, but the final form of mastery. And in trying to hold both visions in his hands, he shattered. Traya saw futility in the Force, Gravid saw potential, but both stood in defiance of what the Force really is, which is uncompromising. Gravid's mind broke because he tried to resolve contradiction with belief. He walked a path no one had successfully walked before, not because it couldn't be conceived, but because it could never survive. This is the final tragedy. Darth Gravid, for all of his heresy, was brilliant. Even in spiritual collapse, he wielded power that nearly killed his apprentice. Had he embraced the dark side without hesitation, he may have become one of the greatest Sith Lords of the Rule of Two. Had he embraced the light, he may have stood among the wisest Jedi of his era. But instead he chose to walk between, and the Force abandoned him for it. The unifying path is an inevitable one, because for every Sith who seeks to dominate, there will come one who seeks to understand, who questions the pain, who seeks another path. But the dark side does not evolve. The dark side devours, and in trying to save the Sith, Gravid nearly destroyed them. Darth Gravid's name is rarely spoken, his memory is buried, his legacy scrubbed from history, reduced to whispers, but his impact endures, because long after his bones have turned to dust, the Sith have still paid the price for his visions. And if you ever wonder why Sidious feared death so deeply, why he hoarded knowledge like a starving man, why he never truly trusted his own creations, it's because deep down, he was always chasing the ghost of Darth Gravid. There are few images in Star Wars as haunting as the mask of Darth Nihilus, a pale, expressionless visage whose hollow black eyes floating above endless robes like a face of death itself. Alongside his crimson lightsaber, these are the only pieces of Nihilus that remain, and yet unlike the relics of most Sith, these objects are more than just trophies. They are cursed, they carry an echo of his hunger. In this holocron, we're not going to retell Nihilus's origin, or the details of Malachor 5. Instead, we'll focus on what relics really mean, what he left behind, his mask, his blade, and why they are unlike any other artifacts in Star Wars. Because unlike other Sith Lords, Nihilus was not truly a man, he was an anomaly, a wound in the Force itself. But what exactly does that mean? To understand why Nihilus lingers where other Sith fade, you need to understand what he really was. Nihilus was not a man who became a Sith, he was a wound. The detonation of the mass shadow generator at Malachor did more than kill soldiers and crush fleets. It tore into the heart of the Force itself. Life was there at one moment, and then it was completely blinked out. Most of the survivors felt trauma, cut off from the Force, but Nihilus felt hunger. He didn't simply breathe in the dark side, he became dependent on it, like a parasite latched onto the wound that had birthed him. From that moment, he was no longer a person any longer. He was absence wearing a mask. Other Sith are consumed because they desired. Exar Kun lusted for immortality. Vitiate drained entire planets to fuel his rituals, but Vitiate chose when to feed. Nihilus was different. His hunger was not ambition, it was a need. He consumed not out of strategy, but out of compulsion, like a black hole that cannot help but pull everything into itself. That is why his relics still echo. Because unlike the spirits of Kun or Ragnos, Nihilus's essence was not tied to personality or legacy. It was tied to the wound of Malachor itself, a scar in the Force that carried inside of himself. Even after his body dissolved, that scar still remained. The anomaly of Nihilus. Most Sith, even the greatest of them, follow a pattern. They seek power, they seek to rule, and they die. Some may leave behind spirits, holocrons, or cursed tombs, but their presence eventually fades into the backgrounds of history. Exar Kun's spirit clung to Yavin 4. Marka Ragnos's lingered as a voice. Palpatine cloned himself. Vader left behind nothing more than fear and a legend. Nihilus was different. His death did not erase him. His hunger was not extinguished. What he left behind was not a ghost, not a holocron, not even a memory. He left behind a wound, a literal tear in the Force that clung to the physical objects that he once touched. His mask and his lightsaber became extensions of that wound. To understand why this matters and what makes it unique, imagine walking into a Sith temple on Korriban, on Ziost, on Malachor. These nexuses of dark energy are oppressive. They radiate malice, suffocation, a kind of spiritual gravity that weighs on anyone sensitive to the Force. Darth Nihilus himself was like a walking Sith temple. His presence was not the presence of a man, but rather of a void. And when he was destroyed, fragments of that void remained behind. The mask. The mask is the most iconic remnant of Darth Nihilus. When Mitra Surik and her allies finally brought him down aboard the Ravager, his body dissolved. He collapsed into nothing but emptiness, leaving behind only his robes and his mask. It's one of the most chilling deaths in Legends because it doesn't feel like a person dying. It feels like a hole is finally closing. And yet the mask itself retained part of that tear. Legends RPG sources of a fan guide often treat the mask as cursed. To wear it or to even hold it was to feel drained, like your life was slowly beginning to siphon away. The mask was not a symbol of who Nihilus had been, it was the vessel of what he had become. Think about what this means compared to other Sith relics. Freedin Nad's sarcophagus carried whispers of his spirit. Exar Kun's amulet could unleash blasts of dark energy. But Nihilus's mask didn't empower, it consumed, just like its master did. His hunger was so absolute that even when his form was gone, the mask carried the echo of that same hunger. In this way, the mask was like a portable nexus of the dark side. To stand near it was to feel the same suffocation as standing in the temple built by the Sith. But unlike temples, which were anchored in one place, the mask of Nihilus could be moved, carried, and spread. It was a wound that lingered like a disease. And then the lightsaber. At first glance, Nihilus's lightsaber is unremarkable. A standard crimson blade, an unremarkable hilt. The iconic symbol of the Sith, sure, but it lacked the exotic designs of Exar Kun, the elegance of Dooku's curved lightsaber, or the mystical grandeur of Ragnos' scepter. But here's the difference. Darth Nihilus's lightsaber had been steeped in his aura for years. He had wielded it while consuming entire planets, while feeding his hunger on fleets and armies. The lightsaber absorbed that presence like a sponge. RPG material about the artifacts and cursed objects in the galaxy notes that items closely tied to the Sith of great power often inherit fragments of their master's essence. In the case of Nihilus, this meant that the lightsaber itself carried the same hollow resonance as the mask. To wield it was to feel gnawed at by the void, to To ignite it was to hear the whispers of hunger. Other Sith lightsabers were weapons of destruction. Darth Nihilus's was a reminder that he was no longer a man carrying a weapon. He was hunger given form. The lightsaber was cursed not by design, but by association. It became less a weapon and more a relic of absence. But here's what makes Darth Nihilus really terrifying. He is not remembered for his conquests or even his personality. He is remembered for his condition. He had ceased to be a person. He was a parasite in the Force, feeding without limit. This is why his relics feel so unique compared to other Sith artifacts. Palpatine's lightsabers didn't drain those who touched them. Vader's lightsaber didn't carry the weight of Mustafar. Plagueis' experiments may have warped life, but his possessions were still tools. Nihilus cursed even the most basic of objects, a mask, a lightsaber, simply by existing. His essence clung to them because his essence was hunger. And hunger doesn't die, it lingers and it waits. But there is something else strange about the mask and the lightsaber of Nihilus that he left behind. Where other Sith relics expand their wielder, Nihilus's curse diminishes them. They are the anti-artifact, drawing in instead of radiating out. In this sense, they are far more terrifying and damaging. Just like Nihilus, they don't even really have a will of their own other than to feed. They are not teaching tools or sources of knowledge, they are traps. This is why Nihilus is one of the most haunting Sith in all of Legends. He is not remembered as a schemer like Sidious. He is not remembered as a conqueror like Revan. He is remembered as the void that he was, an anomaly. And that anomaly explains why his relics lingered when others fade. His hunger was not tied to his spirit, it was tied to the Force itself, like a scar burned into reality. The mask and the saber are the scar tissue, not remnants of life, but remnants of the wound. So when we talk about Darth Nihilus's mask and the lightsaber, we're not talking about trophies, we're talking about cursed objects. We're talking about the echo of a wound in the Force that refused to heal even after Nihilus was seemingly gone. Most Sith die, their legacies rot in tombs, but Nihilus left behind hunger. Hunger that whispers through his mask and his lightsaber. Hunger that can never be silenced. And this leaves us with the chilling question. If Darth Nihilus could curse even the simplest objects with his emptiness, what would the galaxy itself become if his hunger went unchecked? Would the stars themselves have become his relics? The earliest records of the mask after Nihilus's fall take place aboard a ship known as the Nishuaga, a smuggling vessel that crashed on the remote planet of Valak. When salvagers uncovered the wreckage, they discovered the ghost white mask among the debris. Even in this context, it was immediately classified as a Sith artifact. Its aura of corruption was undeniable even to those that could not touch the Force. From here, the mask entered centuries of rumor and legend. Tales spread across the galaxy that the relic was infused with the dark side, so potent that even non-Force sensitive beings could gain the powers of a Sith apprentice simply by putting the mask on. For trained Jedi or Sith, it was said to offer new prophecies, always slanting towards destructive powers. The mask was less a tool of study, and more a direct conduit to the void that Darth Nihilus embodied. Over the next 4,000 years, its reputation only grew. Stories warned that every wielder who tried to harness the mask's gifts was slowly driven towards acts of ruin and self-destruction, compulsively. The same compulsion that forced Nihilus to feed. Where nearly all other Sith artifacts preserved knowledge or granted power, Nihilus's mask devoured those who touched it, pulling them down the same path of annihilation that consumed its master. By the end of the timeline, the mask stood as one of the most infamous relics in the entire galaxy, a curse distinguished as a promise of power, one of the most famous Sith relics that have ever existed in the lore. His lightsaber, by contrast, is far more quiet. We know far less about it, and unlike the mask, it was never whispered about as an artifact of legend. What makes it stand out, though, is ironically, its lack of distinction. As we mentioned earlier, the weapon was streamlined, almost a boring design, a standard red lightsaber devoid of ornament or exotic modifications. For a Sith Lord of such apocalyptic power and hunger, his lightsaber was surprisingly unamusing. What mattered was not the hilt, but the hand that wielded it. This was the blade that had been present as Nihilus drained fleets and devoured worlds, and in that way, it carried the same echo of his presence. But in the centuries after his death, it endured without the same infamy as his mask. The lightsaber was remembered as the weapon of nightmare, yet it never achieved the same cursed reputation. Seemingly, the galaxy itself understood that it was not the weapon, but Nihilus himself that was the anomaly. The weapon survived, but like so many other relics of the old Sith Wars, it was eventually lost to time and legend. There wasn't a building over 2 stories left standing. They turned the planet into one big pile of rubble. This is from Carthonasi, one of the survivors of Taris. In the long history of the Jedi Order, there are battles lost, enemies turned, and truths ignored. But nothing, not even Order 66, stands as a deeper moral failure than the day the Jedi watched a planet die, and ultimately chose to do nothing. This is not a story about the Sith, this is a story about the Jedi Council, and what happens when fear masquerades as wisdom. The planet of Taris, once a booming city world, a hub of commerce and culture. It wasn't Coruscant, but it was an equal to it. Billions lived in the skyscrapers of the upper city, billions more struggled to survive in the undercity beneath it. And yet with all of its divisions, Taris was thriving, connected, it was proud. But then the Sith arrived. It began with the Endar Spire, a Republic Hammerhead-class cruiser carrying one of the most important Jedi of the era, Bastila Shan. Bastila was young, powerful, and gifted with a rare ability known as battle meditation, a force technique that could sway the tide of entire wars, and the Sith wanted her. Darth Malak's fleet ambushed the Endar Spine from orbit above Taris. Sith troopers boarded her ship, but Bastila managed to escape in a pod, crashing deep into the undercity slums. Malak was furious that she had slipped through his fingers, and therefore surrounded the planet with a blockade and began searching for the Jedi. Weeks passed. His fleet found nothing. He grew impatient. And that is when the order came. The search for Bastila is taking too long. We cannot risk her escaping Taris. Destroy the entire planet. Admiral Saw Karath hesitated. Billions lived on Taris, maybe trillions, including Sith troopers including their own. It didn't matter though. Malak didn't care for life. He only wanted silence. And so the sky turned black. From orbit, turbo laser fire rained down. Entire city sectors vaporized in seconds. Skyscrapers disintegrated. Power grids collapsed. Streets cracked and melted. The cultural heart of Taris, the sinking city, was the first to vanish. In mere hours, the entire surface of the planet was scorched, reduced to rubble and twisted steel. Bastila survived, rescued by an amnesiac Jedi Revan and the Mandalorian mercenary Canderous Ordo. They escaped aboard the stolen Ebon Hawk as the planet burned behind them. But these were the exceptions. Taris had a population in the trillions, and nearly all of them were gone. Children, merchants, engineers, scientists, gang members, priests, smugglers, refugees, the outcasts in the undercity, the elite nobles in the upper city. The fire did not discriminate. It devoured everything. The Republic was horrified. Even the Sith, though still human enough to feel it, recoiled. And the Jedi just watched. They had known Bastila was on Taris. They had known that Malak was blockading the world. They had known that Malak was capable of great evil. And still, they refused to intervene. This was not ignorance. This was not a tactical delay. It was a choice. A choice to do nothing. To stay still. To let it happen. What makes this silence even more unbearable is that not all Jedi agreed with it. Some did fight. Bastila herself was already in the field. Other Jedi scattered throughout the Outer Rim had been engaging Sith forces on their own terms. Isolated knights defied the Council and aided Republic forces in secret. Some Jedi died trying to stop the advance of the Sith. There was still courage, there was still light, but there was no support from the High Council. No call to action, no fleets, no protest. From the Council, there was only silence. The survivors, few as they were, carried the scars that the Jedi would never see. Mission Vow, a child whose home and people were turned to dust. Juhani, a Cathar Jedi raised on Taris, would return to her birthplace to find it reduced to rubble. Carthonasi, a Republic pilot haunted by the screams and the fire raining from the sky. Everywhere Revan and Bastila traveled after this, they heard one question whispered. If the Jedi truly guard peace, then why did they let this happen? There is no answer that justifies this question. The Jedi believed that they were preserving balance. They believed their restraint was strength. But Taris proves something else entirely. That the Order, once brave, had been broken. Broken by the Sith, broken by fear. Not fear of battle, not fear of defeat, but a fear of themselves. Fear of what they could become. Fear of creating a new Revan. And that fear cost a planet. The Jedi Order was not always like this though. There was a time when the Jedi leapt to defend worlds without hesitation, when they stood at the front lines of war, igniting their sabers not in conquest but in protection. But that was before the Mandalorian Wars, and before Revan. before everything the Jedi believed about themselves was shattered. The roots of the Jedi Council's inaction on Taris can be tracked all the way back not to Malak, but to Revan. Revan, who had once been their most brilliant student, their greatest hope, a knight whose charisma was outmatched only by his command and understanding in the Force. It was Revan who rallied Jedi to fight in the Mandalorian Wars when the Council refused, Revan who became a hero to the Republic, Revan who had defeated the Mandalorians on Malachor, and it was Revan who fell. When Revan returned, he brought not peace, but an army of darkness. The Jedi who had followed him, hundreds of them would fall too, seduced or broken by war. Revan did not just become a Sith Lord, he built a new Sith Empire from the bones of the Jedi Order itself, and the Council watched their own fall into darkness one by one. Knights, masters, friends. This wasn't a betrayal, it was a plague, and to the Council it proved a terrifying truth, that the Jedi are not corrupted by the Sith, that the Sith are born from the Jedi. This realization became the foundation of a new kind of fear, not fear of external enemies, but fear of internal collapse, of the rot that grows from within. The Jedi began to see the dark side not as an ideology to resist, but as a spiritual infection, something that spread from mind to mind through ambition, through war, through compassion twisted into obsession. They feared that contact with darkness, even in the name of good, could unravel everything. And so the Jedi withdrew. They pulled Jedi back from the battlefronts, discouraged emotional attachment more than ever. They refused to train Force sensitives who showed too much passion, and watched helplessly as Revan's shadow spread across the stars. When Revan was finally defeated, betrayed by his own apprentice Malak, it was not a victory, it was a rearrangement. Now Malak led the war, and the Jedi were no longer facing an ideology, they were facing themselves, but dark and twisted. So when Bastila disappeared over Taris, the Council hesitated, not because they didn't care about her or the planet, but because they saw a familiar pattern that was now repeating. A young, powerful Jedi on a world blockaded by a former Jedi Knight turned Sith, the Republic begging for help, the Council hearing echoes of the past. To intervene would mean war. To go to Taris would mean sending more Jedi into the mouth of corruption. And that is what the High Council feared the most. Not defeat, not even Bastila's death, but the idea that in trying to save her, they would create another Malak. Their fear was not irrational, but it was paralyzing. And fear, as the Jedi themselves would teach, leads to suffering. But here's the cruel irony. The Jedi Order feared creating a new Sith so deeply that they forgot the first Sith were created through abandonment. Revan rose because the Council refused to act during the Mandalorian Wars. Malak rose because Revan believed the Council was blind. And now, Taris would fall because the Jedi still had not learned. They believed detachment would protect them, but all it did was isolate them from the very people that they swore to defend. It's easy to claim spiritual wisdom while sitting in a temple on Dantooine. It's harder when the skies over a city world are glowing in fire, and the screams of billions echo in the Force. Malak understood this. He understood that the Jedi Council's inaction was no longer a tactic, but this was a pattern, a wound that never healed. Malak didn't just bomb Taris to kill Bastila. He bombed Taris to expose the Jedi, to force them to act, to test whether the Guardians of the Republic were still capable of guarding anything at all. And when they did nothing, when no fleet arrived, when no Jedi intervened, Malak had proved his point. The Jedi were paralyzed with fear that he created. And this is what makes the tragedy of Taris so powerful. It wasn't a military misstep. It wasn't a miscalculation. It wasn't even a spiritual collapse. The Jedi Council believed that they were acting wisely, but they were really acting from trauma, the trauma of Revan's fall. And in trying to avoid another Revan, they allowed Malak to go unchecked. But not every Jedi agreed. Some still fought. Bastila herself, lone knights operating without orders. Even Revan, stripped of memory, was attempting to make things right. But without the support of the Council, these Jedi were scattered, disjointed, flickers of light in the galaxy darkening by the hour. Taris was not destroyed by the Sith, it was abandoned by the Jedi. And that abandonment was not just physical, it was moral, it was philosophical. It was the moment the Order stopped being defenders of peace and became defenders of silence. To be a Jedi is to act, the Jedi Master Atris once said. But by the time of Taris, the Council no longer believed that. They believed that to be a Jedi was to wait, to observe, to detach. And so they waited and observed. They did nothing. And Taris died. Taris burned. They told themselves they were preserving balance, that to act hastily would to create more darkness, that silence, restraint, and detachment were virtues. But the galaxy saw it differently, and the Jedi felt it in the Force. They had let billions, maybe trillions die, not because they couldn't act, but because they were too afraid of what acting would lead to. The shame of this would never leave them. Centuries later, when war returned, so did that same fear. But this time it looked different. It wore the face of Dooku, a former Jedi, a respected master, a political idealist turned separatist warlord. Once again, the enemy had stemmed from within. And this time, the Jedi would not hesitate. The Jedi would join the Clone Wars. When the separatist movement erupted into full-blown galactic conflict, the Jedi remembered Taris. They remembered what happened the last time they had refused to fight. The Jedi remembered Bastila, they remembered Malak, and they remembered what inaction had cost them. So when the Grand Army of the Republic arrived on Geonosis, led by clone soldiers and sanctioned by the Senate, the Jedi joined in without question. They had become generals. In a single day, the Jedi abandoned their ancient role as peacekeepers and accepted a new identity, as warriors of the Republic. They told themselves it was different, that the Clone Wars was just, that Dooku had already fallen, that they were protecting democracy, but deep down, it was still fear. Fear of another Taris, fear of another Revan, fear of standing still while the galaxy burned. The Jedi's greatest mistake in the era of Malak was inaction. Their greatest mistake during the Clone Wars was overcorrection. They didn't just act, they surrendered their identity. The Jedi once swore to avoid all politics. Now they were bound to the will of the Senate. The Jedi once valued independence. Now they commanded genetically engineered soldiers bred for war. The Jedi once taught that peace was the highest goal. Now they issued kill orders on battlefields across the galaxy. They had traded detachment for domination, all in the name of preventing another tragedy. And still, the tragedy came. Yoda, the oldest and the wisest of them, sensed the danger too late. He saw the Jedi slipping deeper into the war machine. He saw how their compassion was becoming control, how the fear of failure had pushed them into the arms of power. He watched as Jedi became distant, more militarized, hollow, and he began to understand. Too sure of themselves they were, even the older, the more experienced ones. The shroud of the dark side had fallen. The Clone Wars were not just a war. The Clone Wars were a trap, and the Jedi had walked into it willingly. Palpatine never needed to force the Jedi into war. He just needed to wait. He knew they would join, because Palpatine understood what Taris had done to them. He knew that fear would drive them back into the battlefield, this time without hesitation, but with conviction. Conviction without clarity, though, is still blindness, and action driven by fear is still dark. So when the Jedi fell, not just at the end of the Clone Wars but in spirit, they didn't fall because they were betrayed. They fell because they had already lost themselves piece by piece, battle by battle, death by death. And all of it began with their fear of facing what they had created. The Sith born from their own silence. The Jedi did not want another Revan. They ignored Malak. So when the next war came, they didn't want another Taris. So they joined the war blindly and created Vader. However, there was one Jedi who seemingly escaped this cycle, Luke Skywalker. He faced his father, the very product of the Jedi's fall, and he didn't give in to fear. Luke rejected vengeance. He threw down his weapon. Luke acknowledged the darkness, but he didn't surrender to it. He didn't deny it or run from it. He stood in front of it with open hands and allowed the Force to decide. He saw the flaw in the old ways, and for a time it seemed that he had found the balance the Jedi Order had always preached but never practiced. But even Luke could not stop what would come next. His own student, his own nephew, Jacen Solo, bright, idealistic, noble, a hero of the Yuzhong Vong War. He was a peacekeeper, a philosopher, and then Darth Kaitis. Jacen did not fall because he craved power. He fell because he was afraid of loss, afraid of chaos, afraid of failing to protect what he loved. He became the very thing he had always fought against. And once again, the galaxy saw the pattern. A Jedi falling, becoming a Sith, and bringing suffering. This is the terrifying truth that lies beneath all of it. The Jedi do not simply fight the Sith, they give birth to them. They fear the dark side, so they teach suppression. They fear failure, so they teach detachment. They fear chaos, so they embrace total control. But here is the big lesson. Fear is not the opposite of the dark side. fear is the dark side just beginning. The Council of the Jedi Civil War era were afraid of one truth. The truth that the Sith come from the Jedi. Not from the outside, but from within. Revan, Malak, Dooku, Vader, Kaitis, all of them trained in the Jedi arts, all of them raised in the halls of the Jedi Temple, all of them fell. The galaxy saw it, the Jedi knew it, and the Council became obsessed with stopping that spread. They misunderstood the disease though. They thought the darkness could be sealed away through silence, obedience, and suppression. They thought that if they avoided war, avoided passion, avoided detachment, that they could stop it from taking root. But they failed to understand that the dark side is not a foreign infection. It is not passed from Sith to Jedi like a curse. It is cultivated. It is grown. It is grown in the very soil that the Jedi build their order on. When fear of the dark side becomes stronger than compassion for the living, this is where the virus lives. It doesn't live in holocrons, it doesn't live in Sith temples, not even in red lightsabers, but in Jedi silence, in Jedi fear. Malak knew this. He knew he didn't need to break the Jedi. He needed them to break themselves through this fear, to hold back their knights, to preserve the purity of their order at the expense of an entire world, of trillions of lives. That was the infection. It spread not because the Jedi were evil, but because they were afraid of becoming evil. With Luke, for a moment it seemed that the virus had been contained, but even Luke, the Jedi who saw clearly, could not stop it from re-emerging in someone that even he loved. Jacen Solo fell because of fear of loss, and fear of failure. The Council of this era believed that the Jedi were not just vulnerable to the dark side, that they were its primary carriers. And until they confronted that truth, until they faced not the Sith, but the shadow that they cast themselves, the cycle will never end. The Sith will always return, and the Jedi will have to bury the bodies of those they were too afraid to save. There are few sights in Star Wars lore as unsettling as the Emperor's Royal Guard. Crimson robes, faceless visors, silent devotion. They were not stormtroopers nor officers. They were extensions of Palpatine's will, guardians who stood at his side in complete silence. But within their ranks there existed something even darker, a different version, the Shadow Guard. Clad not in red but in black, wielding not ceremonial pikes but lightsaber-bladed weapons of war. They did not speak, they did not question. They existed only as the Emperor's mute, force-sensitive enforcers. Rumors surrounded them even within the Empire. Some believed that they were former Jedi Knights, captured, tortured, and broken until their voices failed. Others thought of them as elite assassins, enhanced through alchemy. But the truth is even more disturbing. The Shadow Guard were the Emperor's attempt to go further than the Royal Guard, to build a core of living shadows whose minds had been erased and tied only to his own. A project inspired by the methods of Darth Vitiate himself. This is the story of the Emperor's Shadow Guard, silent, terrifying, and perhaps the last true secret that even Darth Vader was never meant to fully uncover. Today we will be analyzing the most secretive and precious darkside organization within the entire Empire, at least to Darth Sidious, the only group that he didn't actively share information about to Darth Vader, including their identity, their training, and most important, their purpose. So greetings lore junkies, and welcome back to the archives. Today, we'll be looking at the Shadow Guard. To understand the Shadow Guard, we first need to understand the crucible of the Imperial Royal Guard. Recruits chosen from across the Empire, often stormtroopers, commandos, or soldiers already proven in loyalty and battle. They would be sent to the world of Yin-Chor, a desert planet that served as a training ground. The program was a simple one, but brutal. Hundreds entered, and only a handful ever survived the process. Trainees fought one another in lethal contests, encouraged to kill comrades to prove absolute devotion to their emperor. By the end, those that remained were transformed into silent guardians clad in crimson, whose mere presence radiated only fear. Their weapons, typically force pikes, were ceremonial but deadly. The Emperor's Red Guard were already an elite order on their own, feared across the stars. But there were always anomalies. Amid the survivors, some displayed feats that could not be explained by sheer conditioning or skill. Reflexes faster than any soldier, perception sharper than any human sense, impossible survivals, These few were quietly separated. They were screened for force sensitivity, and when it was confirmed, their fate diverged from others. They were not to be mere guards, they were to become something else entirely. This was the seed of the Shadow Guard, elite soldiers forged through the crucible of Yin Chor, then reshaped into dark side adepts. What made the Shadow Guard so different was not just their skill, but it was their silence. Although there was a lot of conditioning and programming, many Red Royal Guards still maintained some individuality under their masks of discipline. The Shadow Guard, however, were stripped of identity entirely, stripped of their voice. In fact, they were famous for never speaking. The reason for this is to them there was nothing left to speak from. All of their personalities, their ambitions, and even their sense of self-preservation was erased. This was not loyalty in a normal sense, it was possession. Their minds were wiped, and they became vessels for the will of their master. The Emperor dominated their will in a way that mirrored the Imperial Guard of Darth Vitiate. Centuries earlier, Vitiate had built his own corps of guardians whose very minds were bound to him, their individuality hollowed out until they existed only as vessels of his will and his power. His guards were so devoted to Vitiate that they would even stand against other Sith Lords, in some cases, even members of the Dark Council. Palpatine adapted this model. The Shadow Guard were not trained to serve, they were made to be a part of him. Their silence reflected this erasure. They did not need words because the Emperor was their voice. This made the Shadow Guard fundamentally different from the Inquisitors. Inquisitors were fallen Jedi, forced to serve through pain or fear, and always at risk of betrayal. The Shadow Guard, literally though, could no longer betray. They could no longer hesitate. They could not defect. There has never been a record of one abandoning Palpatine's command ever, not once. In this way, they were not soldiers, but proof of Sidious's obsession. The absolute control meant not just obedience, but the annihilation of self. The foundation of the Shadow Guard was the same martial excellence as the Red Guard: unarmed combat, bladed weapons, squad leadership tactics. But layered onto this foundation was something the Crimson Guards would never receive: formal training in the dark side of the Force. The Shadow Guard learned abilities that most Imperials thought impossible outside of Sith, even among the Inquisitors. They could unleash Force lightning, but the ability to channel pure rage and pure hatred. To wield it, they had to embrace anger. To survive it, they had to endure it. Many were likely forced to withstand lightning as a part of this conditioning. Some speculate the Inquisitors were used to train the Shadow Guard, striking them with lightning as tests of survival, while others suggest that Sidious himself instructed them in secret, behind closed doors, away from Vader's gaze. In addition, they learned Force Choke, Pulse, Repulse, and even Maelstrom. Unlike the Inquisitors who specialized in lightsaber combat, the Shadow Guard emphasized shock powers, overwhelming Force abilities used in tandem with their martial prowess. Their signature weapon was the lightsaber pike, a hybrid of the traditional Guard's Force pike and a Jedi weapon. The red blade extended from the tip. It granted reach and leverage in duels. Against Jedi, it was unorthodox and a challenge. This was all by design. Palpatine thrived on the unconventional. Just as he had used Grievous to overwhelm Jedi with alien forms and flurries of blades, and just as the Inquisitors were trained to fight in spinning, unpredictable styles, the lightsaber pike was yet another shock weapon. It forced Jedi to fight in ways that they had not trained for, breaking their rhythm and exploiting hesitation. But unlike Grievous or the Inquisitors, the Shadow Guard wielded these weapons with no concern for their own survival. They did not care if their parries shattered their arms, or if their charges left them open to a death blow. Their goal was not victory, it was only ever obedience. The existence of the Shadow Guard was not hidden among the Empire, but its nature was, even from Darth Vader. The secrecy is telling. Vader oversaw the Inquisitors, breaking and training them himself. Their successes and their failures were his responsibility. But the Shadow Guard were deliberately kept outside of his sphere. Their training was compartmentalized. Their orders came directly from Sidious, and even their origins were obscured. But why? It's because the Shadow Guards were not guards at all. They were the failsafe. Palpatine expected betrayal from Darth Vader. It is the way of the Sith. But if Vader turned against him ever, the Inquisitors could not be trusted to stop him alone. Vader had trained them, he knew their every weakness. The Shadow Guard, however, they were loyal only to Sidious. Their minds bowed before his. Their silence was proof of this. Their identity was no longer just erased to the level of a Red Royal Guard through propaganda and drills. The Shadow Guard seemed to be an experiment where Sidious had literally deleted everything but his own will within these avatars. They were more than soldiers. They did not fear, and they would fight to the death. They were the Emperor's insurance policy against Darth Vader. Warriors that would fall by his blade by the dozens, and a dozen more would rally to attack yet again. They guarded the Emperor's most sensitive strongholds when not with him, installations, and secrets. When the Inquisitors hunted Jedi, the Shadow Guard were sent to destroy secrets deemed too dangerous for even Vader to possess. They were created to silence rivals. They led squads of stormtroopers and naval commandos, serving as the nucleus of strike teams. Their presence alone elevated missions into something far more than routine. Their most famous encounters were with Galen Merrick's Starkiller. The Shadow Guards fought him across Nar Shaddaa, Cloud City, Kashyyyk, Raxus Prime, and even the first Death Star. They fought and they died to him without hesitation. They were not expected to succeed. Starkiller overwhelmed them, but this only underlines their role. The Shadow Guard were the Emperor's black blades, sent into impossible battles because no one else could be trusted. No one else would so willingly die. The Shadow Guards reveal something clear. They were the governing force of the dark side in this era. Palpatine placed them not only against Jedi, but against his rivals. They served as enforcers, silencers, and watchdogs. In them, the Emperor had a final line of defense against betrayal, from the Inquisitors, from other Sith, and most important, from Darth Vader. Think of them as silent governors and watchers, not governors of worlds, but the governors of the dark side. They enforced the Emperor's supremacy not through politics or fear of bureaucracy, but through raw, unquestioning, silent power. They are also the rarest version of the Emperor's Royal Guard. Sidious knew that even entire squads of his Red Royal Guard could not withstand his apprentice. He knew the Inquisitors would crumble in fear before him. But the Shadow Guard, they were different. They combined the Guard's discipline with the Inquisitor's power, but without the weaknesses of either. They would keep advancing even as Vader cut them down, because their minds were no longer their own. They would die without fear, without hesitation, and without pause. They were, in essence, Palpatine's way of saying, if my apprentice turns, I have warriors who will throw themselves at him until nothing remains. The Inquisitorius collapsed before the rise of the rebellion. Many fell, betrayed, or were destroyed. But the Shadow Guard endured longer. They survived in the era of the Death Star and beyond, still whispering through the Empire as the Emperor's most loyal protectors. They may have even been the foundation of Palpatine's future vision, a core of Force-sensitive guardians who could replace even the Crimson Royal Guard. Like Vitiate before him, Sidious dreamed of a guard so loyal, so erased of self, that they could outlast apprentices and even entire empires. Had Sidious's reign continued, it is possible the Shadow Guard would have become the ultimate enforcers of his will, an order of silent Force warriors ruling the galaxy as the Emperor's eternal shadow. The Shadow Guard were never numerous, they were never celebrated. They existed in the margins, whispered of, but rarely seen. Yet in their silence lies the truth of Palpatine's philosophy. They were no longer men. They were not Jedi or Sith. They were shadows, minds erased, voices silenced, wills bound. They serve as a terrifying reminder that in Sidious's empire, even loyalty could be weaponized until nothing human remained. And perhaps most haunting of all is the thought of what they could have become. Had the Emperor lived, had his order endured, the Shadow Guard would have evolved into something far more dangerous than the Inquisitors, a corps of governors of the dark side, an eternal guard who would never betray, never falter, and never stop. An overlooked aspect of the Sith is their creation of monsters. Twisting life to breed sickening alchemical creatures is actually the very foundation of their order. It was Force alchemy that caused a Junta Pal and his followers to be expelled from the Jedi, creating the Second Great Schism. Creating monsters, though, was an art somewhat considered to be lost to the modern Sith, at least until Darth Sidious brought it back. Strangely though, unlike the glorious monsters of the ancient Sith, Palpatine's own aren't something we often get a glimpse of, but Sidious cared enough about this art to write an entire book about it, and as a man who often emulated the ancient Sith, we wanted to find out what nightmarish creatures he had in the making. Welcome back to the Archives, Lore Junkies, and let's begin with the monsters of Darth Sidious. When looking at first, it seems almost counterintuitive for a rule of 2 Sith to be bothering with monsters. Much like in lightsaber duels, alchemical beasts could be interpreted as a thing of the past. After all, it's not as though modern Sith are needing living siege weapons for the front lines of battle, nor do they require mythical guardians for their tombs. The rule of 2 was characterized by subtlety and finesse. Political acumen and business manipulations were how they secured their power in this era. However, Palpatine remained adamant that certain ancient dark-side practices remain relevant in the modern day. Particularly, the reason was because Palpatine was a monster himself deep down. He shared a lot in common with savage, bloodthirsty beasts, a trait his master Plagueis noted with him during his youth. In these beasts, Palpatine found kindred spirits. Sidious was always described as having the bloodlust of a serial killer, and when he got into combat, he tended to snarl and to gnash his teeth. At one point, he went on such a rampage against his foes that he began to foam at the mouth like a feral animal. Buried beneath the facade of a put-together galactic ruler, Sidious was pretty much Sith spawn himself. One might even say that in a sense, he shares a kindred spirit with them. While he didn't do as much monster making in his time as Chancellor, he enjoyed the practice as Emperor. Unfortunately for him though, his schedule as ruler of the galaxy left little time for alchemy, so many monsters created during the reign of the Empire were carried out by underlings like Lord Kronal, the man literally labeled as Sidious's monster maker. However, when he was resurrected in the year 10 ABY and came back with the Dark Empire, Sidious unveiled many Sith spawn that he had always wanted to develop. As a resurrected emperor, he no longer concerned himself with keeping his identity secret, and so he flaunted the dark side in many ways against his enemies. Most notably, he finally got to use these monsters. But beyond just developing, he documented. During this time, he would outline his perspective on the topic in an aptly named Creation of Monsters book. This was a section that he wrote in his manifesto titled The Dark Side Compendium. Here, Sidious gives the philosophy that young Sith should take when making their own creatures of nightmare. This is what he has to say on the usefulness of monsters. Although the Force can be used to create terrifying illusions, it is sometimes more satisfying to create actual creatures that are willing and eager to shred and devour one's enemies on command. Such monsters are most useful when maintaining discipline and anxiety among subjects and enemies while one's attention is required elsewhere. These creations must be able to follow basic commands, but should not be designed with too much intelligence or self-awareness. Their function is first and foremost to serve their master. Sidious would give practical advice on what to do when considering making a monster. He went on to go over how to examine a creature for its natural defensive attributes, and then enhancing them to become more fearsome. He also notes about shoring up its weaknesses, adding things to make it more powerful. But at the same time, one mustn't make a monster too powerful. Palpatine recommends keeping at least one weakness that only the maker should know. A failsafe is always important just in case the monster grows out of hand. This was an important feature that many ancient Sith neglected, leading to Sith spawn that ended up conquering them instead. Palpatine was very calculated with every one of his creations. Although there are very few to mention, he crafted each one with delicate care. He also tended to do things a lot differently than his predecessors would. Often when we think of Sith spawn mutants, our mind often goes to large beasts that would find a home in the pages of mythology. Creatures like the Terentatek and the Warworm come to mind, hulking titans that slaughtered Jedi by the dozens, used in large battlefield engagements. But Palpatine did not create very many of these kinds of monsters, if any at all. And there is a reason for it. But one of the larger creatures that Sidious did invest in were called the Chrysalide Rancors, sometimes referred to as Chrysalide for short. The recipe for these Rancors came all the way from the ancient Sith purebloods. In the pureblooded culture, the Chrysalides served as pets or protectors of Sith nobility. It was thought that knowledge of how to make them were lost. That wasn't until Sidious uncovered the knowledge and was able to replicate it. Their namesake comes from the fact that these Rancors were created through the use of gigantic cocoon or a chrysalis like a titanic insect. These cocoons were created through alchemy and seemed to carry the unknown process of mutating Rancors into chrysalides. When they emerged, they were much larger in size and had a pale and a deep green color. During the New Republic's battle against the Dark Empire on Biss, the New Republic unveiled the X-1 Viper droids. This was their version of the larger walker tanks with heavier armor. It is said that they were more than a match for the Empire's AT-ATs at the time, a huge advancement for the Republic. Their front pincers were equipped with powerful cannons that carried the punch of capital ship turbo lasers. The Vipers were effective primarily due to their advanced full-body molecular shielding, which they wore as shells. This experimental technology not only blocked most conventional weapons, but also absorbed the energy of a laser blast, then used it to charge the power cells of its own weapon systems in turn. It could absorb other energy weapon fire as well, such as ion cannons, turbo lasers, and energy torpedoes. The battle droid also had the power to shoot these attacks back at their targets directly, some of the deadliest droids in all of the documented lore. During the battle, these Vipers were mowing down Imperial forces by the dozens, until the Emperor unveiled the chrysalide Rancor. The creatures were able to smash the X-1 Vipers like they were nothing. Their jaws were able to chew straight through the heavy armor and the molecular shielding of even the most advanced technology the galaxy had at the time, proving that the Ancients still had their place in warfare. Even the powerful turbo laser weapons and the strong pincers of the Vipers had no effect on the Rancors. The New Republic army was completely rerouted, and the battle turned against their favor, forcing a retreat. This was the military power of a fully grown Sith spawn mutant. This was the reason they were so effective in all eras of the galaxy. They were living artillery, and in some cases, living superweapons. But these giant monsters were the only recorded specimen of Sidious using a beast of great size. Surprisingly, as fond of superweapons as he was, Palpatine actually warned against the creation of giant creatures. We see him glorifying the ways of the ancient Sith normally, but this is one time where he actually has a contrarian view on their ways. This is what he writes in his book. Do not disregard such practical aspects as whether the monster will be required to access standard doorways, or travel upon floors that can support only a limited amount of weight. A large beast is a wondrous thing to behold, but it can also make an easy target. Sith like Naga Sadow, Sorza Sin, and Exar Kun were fond of these massive monsters, but according to both this quote and Sidious's own repertoire of creations, he heavily favored more humanoid-style mutants. The first of these to mention are the Imperial Sentinels. Sidious made these beings as an alchemical race completely subservient to his will. Only he and his inner circle of dark acolytes were privy to the knowledge of how the Sentinels were made. No one else, not even the Sovereign Protectors, had any knowledge of their true origins. Sentinels were cloned from the tissue stock and hidden facilities of Biss. This process involved introducing chemicals to their bodies during the growth period, which would suppress their higher mental faculties. They were unable to speak or really understand anything but blind obedience and combat. During their growth cycle, Sentinels were mutated by Sidious's dark side adepts, and when this happens, the adepts would form a mental bond with the Sentinel. If the process was successful, the Sentinels would end up as mindless living hulks, totally dependent on the will of the adepts for purpose or even movement. They were essentially puppets of raw strength, animated only by the dark side and the will of their makers. Originally, Sidious had attempted to clone them from Force sensitives, but as usual, Force sensitive cloning proved to be unstable. The first generation Sentinels were said to be much too dangerous due to their instability, and so the first gens were disposed of secretly. While the subsequent generations were less powerful, they proved much easier to control, and for Palpatine, this was much more preferable. But even at a lesser power, they proved to be terrifying. They were twice the size and strength of royal guards, who were each already equivalent to a Jedi Knight. The Imperial Sentinels were only spoken of as rumors during the era of the Empire. Any who actually saw them thought of them as large droids, experiments gone wrong. They wouldn't be seen in the light of day until Sidious's return in the Dark Empire, when he kept the Sentinels very close to him at all times. But speaking of living droids and the Dark Empire, this happens to pertain to our next of Palpatine's Sith spawn. Let us introduce you to the Shadow Droids. Shadow Droids might just be the most horrific experiment yet. Imagine, if you would, a vulture droid, but inside of it is the organic brain of what was once a living pilot. This is what the Shadow Droids were. Tired at the incompetent TIE fighter pilots, Sidious decided to create something that could keep pace with the New Republic's adept X-Wing flyers, and so he took the finest pilots that the Empire had and removed their brains. He then stripped out everything that the brain had that made it an individual, tearing out every shred of humanity, and hooked it up to cybernetic hardware. They were kept living and preserved through alchemy, and he augmented their reflexes and abilities far beyond anything that was possible. The Emperor then gave his hideous creations one final gift. He gifted them the ability to touch the dark side. Essentially, this made them remote extensions of his own will. They were the perfect answer to the capable pilots of the rebellion, which had become the scourge of the Empire in nearly every encounter. The reason the precious Death Star project had failed. And so Sidious's answer was to make pilots that not only had no fear nor compassion, but were as calculating as droids were, and had the precision and the reaction time of Force sensitives. Their brains were placed in the ships so that they had no delay between thought and action. The fighter had become their new bodies. A fate worse than death for Imperial pilots who proved to be too good at their jobs. The next alchemical creation we want to mention is known as the Smoke Demons. Sidious himself doesn't have recorded instances of summoning these beings, but a Dark Jedi by the name of Taris does, and she reportedly learned this ability from Darth Vader. Based on what we know, Vader never studies the ways of ancient Sith unless it's at the behest of his master. His master controls all the flow of information about the ancients, so if Vader of all people knows a Sith spell, then Sidious is certainly the one behind it. It's not a leap for us to say that because the spell to create it, called the Dwamiska, comes from an ancient scroll recovered by Sorza's Sin, Palpatine is known to have almost all of Sin's works, being a huge fan of hers. In the vast dark side library of Darth Sidious, he has commentated on all of them, so he knows this spell well. A smoke demon, also known as a Siska in the Sith tongue, was an incorporeal manifestation of the dark side. When summoned against an enemy, they assumed the form of the victim's worst fear, much like a Bogart would. They could then paralyze the target and absorb their body by flowing into it, vaporizing it. This would entrap the victim's very soul within their smoky body, which would be released only upon the demon's destruction. Despite being made of a smoky substance, these things had significant strength, as one was able to defeat Chewbacca one-on-one. Regular weaponry has no effect on them. However, they can be harmed by the unique properties of a lightsaber. Finally, we have to end with Darth Sidious's favorite monster by far, what he called his minor masterpiece, a monster known as Darth Vader. This is what Sidious writes of Vader. Of all the monsters I have created, I regard Darth Vader as something of a minor masterpiece. No, he was not an entirely alchemical creation, but he was my monster nevertheless. Even though he failed to live up to his full potential, there was much pleasure in transforming Anakin Skywalker from a bright-eyed, tassel-headed youth into the greatest Jedi killer of all time. Yes, he ultimately turned against his master, as monsters sometimes do, but that was my fault, not his. Given the opportunity to create Vader again, I would, and with zeal. In the novel The Rise and Fall of Darth Vader, it is confirmed that Sidious used potions and alchemy to keep Anakin alive on the trip back from Mustafar. And during the several-day construction of Lord Vader, Sidious was spending all of his time conducting rituals, utilizing his artifacts in order to keep the transformation process alive. In this way, Vader is included with Sidious's monsters appropriately. Like he said, Vader may have not been an entirely alchemical creation the way that the others were. He was not a creation like the Chrysalide or the Sentinels, but there was alchemy involved. It took decades for Sidious to warp the Jedi's greatest hero into the bane of their existence. And after all, annihilating Jedi is the main reason why every Sith spawn creature exists. And so, that was our deep dive into Sidious's alchemical monsters. This aspect of the dark side is something we think isn't talked about enough in the lore. I really wish in the lore we got more insight into how the process actually works and functions. A lot of it is just theory in the end result, but what does alchemy actually look like? Mostly we get vague references to rituals, chemicals, and potions, but little else than that. However, the results of the process is always grandiose in scale. But what do you think, my friends? Do you wish we got to see more Sith mutants, Sidious's creations included? I think there's a lot of storytelling potential here. There's an easy way to make a horror-related creature feature with Sith spawn as its main focus. There's just so much potential here. The closest things we get to it are the Death Trooper novel and Red Harvest, but there's still plenty of monster stories left to tell with the Sith and the dark side involved. But as always, my friends, thank you so much for watching and supporting the channel, and until next time, may the Force be with you.